Hello and good morning. It is a pleasure for me to be here once again at Rovira Virgili University, putting the almost finishing touches on a project that I have been happy and very interesting experience of co-directing as along with Professor Andreas Coccholio,
aprendido
a project in which I
muchas
have
cosas.
truly
Bien,
learned a great
ahora me voy a
deal about
centrar
many things. Now,
en lo que es mi
I will
intervención
focus on my presentation.
de ahora, lo que me toca,
At
que
this
se
time,
llama
it is down to me
Transición
to present
energética y
energy
transiciones
transitions and
sobrevenidas.
transitions of
Es
circumstance.
un titular que está
This is a title.
en mi capítulo del
It is
libro
the title of one of the chapters of the book
que hemos
that
editado
we have
y que,
published.
bueno, que en definitiva
And
lo que
truth be
pretendo
told,
con
what I
esta
am attempting to
intervención
do
es
in
saber
this
dónde estamos
presentation is to give you an
dónde
idea
estamos
of
porque
where
en el
we are.
sector
I want to tell you
energético, la
where we
transición
are because in
energética
the energy transition, the whole issue
se está
of the
desarrollando a un
the
ritmo
energy transition
trepidante
is taking place
desde que
at
se
a breakneck
formuló
pace
en el
from the time it
2011
was
y que
formulated
hay
in
recorrido como para
2011.
valorar
There has
qué es lo
been
que
a
se ha hecho
progress
y
made.
hemos incorporado
We can
algo
look
a
back and
los
evaluate what has
objetivos,
been done,
ya les digo que sí,
and we have
o
made progress
hemos hecho
towards
alguna desviación y
our
se nos ha
goals. I
quedado
can confirm that that
algo
is
por
the
el
case.
camino. También
But
es
have
verdad
we
que,
also
bueno,
deviated from the
las tenemos
pathway?
las
Yes,
comunidades
we have. And that
energéticas,
could be the case of energy
en modo
communities,
alguno tienen la misma
which
presencia que otros
in
elementos y otros
no
objetivos de
way do
la
they have the same
transición
presence as other elements
energética.
that could be
Bien,
among
a mí
those
me
of
gusta
the
recordar
energy
que la
transition.
transición energética
I'd like to remind
se
you
formula
that
por
the
primera
energy
vez en el
transition was
2011.
first put
En el
forth in the year
2011,
2011
con la Comisión Barroso, cuando
with the
en una
European
de esas
Commission
ocasiones en la que
under the
Europa se
leadership of
reinventa.
Barroso. It
¿Vale?
was a moment,
Europa se
one
ha
of those moments in
reinventado
which
varias
Europe
veces, que es
was
el Acta de la Unión
reinventing
Europea, que es el
itself.
mercado único. Pues
It has
Europa
reinvented itself
2020
over
fue
the
también
years,
una oportunidad
changing from the common market to the European market, the European
de avance,
community,
¿no?
and that was another moment of
¿Y qué
transition,
pasó
a moment of
qué pasaba
advancement in 2011.
cómo encaja ahí la transición
And how did the energy
energética? Pues
transition fit
encaja
into
en
that moment of
que
transition for the
se
European
ve la
Union?
oportunidad de hacer un gran pacto
It
social
fit into it
haciendo de la
because there was
energía
an
un,
opportunity to have a great social
un
pact,
elemento de
making energy
innovación y de
an
reactivación
element of
económica
innovation
al
and
tiempo
economic
que se
reactivation.
soluciona los
At the same
problemas que
time,
ya se
we were
estaban
solving
empezando
some of
a
the problems
plantear de
that were
cara al
beginning to
futuro en el 2011.
arise
El problema es
as
que
we
hay
look to the future.
una energética,
The
una
problem
infraestructura
was that there were
energética
grids
en
and
Europa
energy
de 8 millones de
infrastructures
kilómetros,
in
¿vale?
Europe
Que hay que
of
renovar
8 million
y que ya es
kilometers
centenaria.
that had to be
Entonces, ahí
renewed,
hay
that was
un
already
diálogo,
100 years
¿no?
old.
De, bueno, pues sector privado, sector
Therefore, there was
público,
dialogue
quién
among the
interviene,
public
etcétera.
and private
Entonces,
sector,
la
other
Comisión
stakeholders,
Barroso
and so
dice,
forth.
ah, mira qué
The
oportunidad
EU Commission
para,
under
a partir
Barroso
de esa
said this is a great
renovación
opportunity to renew all of
energética
this,
absolutamente imprescindible,
which was absolutely
pues
essential.
podemos reactivar
And in this
la
renewal
economía,
process, we can
renovar las
reactivate our
profesiones
economies.
y
We
las
can
titulaciones,
update our
descarbonizar y de
professions
paso
and
cumplimos
degrees. We
objetivos
can decarbonize.
climáticos,
We
etcétera,
can meet
etcétera.
the
Entonces,
climate
así
change
quedó
goals and
definida
so
la
forth.
transición energética
And so
en
an
ese
entire energy
documento
transition was defined
del
in a
2011 como
document
un
of
proceso con
2011.
un
It
doble
was defined
objetivo.
as a
Por una
process
parte,
with a twofold
desarmonizar,
objective. One, to
hacer la transición
decarbonize,
progresiva
to
de renovables,
progressively
de fósiles
replace
a
fossil
renovables
fuels
y
with renewable
al mismo
fuels,
tiempo,
renewable energy sources,
instaurar
and
un
at the
nuevo
same
modelo
time to
energético,
implement a
un nuevo
new
modelo energético
energy
con
model
nuevos actores y que
with
llevara
new
a la
players
sociedad, a los
that would take
consumidores, a la
society, that would take
ciudadanía, las
consumers,
ventajas de
citizens, and
que propicia
to
los
all of the
nuevos estados
advantages that would come about
tecnológicos.
with
Entonces, ese
all of this
nuevo
new
modelo
energy technology.
energético estaba
The new energy model
configurado como
was
un
to be
elemento, como
configured
un modelo
as
descentralizado con
a
nuevos actores,
decentralized
miles de
model
nuevos
with
actores,
new players,
limpio,
thousands of new
de
players. It would
proximidad
be clean,
y
it would be
digitalizado.
close by,
Y
and it would be
digitalizado.
digitalized.
Muy
And that
importante,
is a
porque
very
ese
important
elemento de
aspect.
digitalización
This element of
tiene un
digitalization
desarrollo, estaba
would
muy
also
vinculado
undergo
a ese modelo
significant
de
development,
transición
very closely
energética,
linked
tiene un
to the
desarrollo
energy transition
en
model.
las
It would
redes,
have its own
en la
development
publicación de redes
in
inteligentes del mismo año,
the Smart
pero
Grids
luego,
publication from that
curiosamente, se
same year.
abandona ese
But
planteamiento
that
general
idea was
de
progressively
digitalización
abandoned.
dentro del
The
proceso que
idea of
discurre
progressive
en
digitalization within this
Virgili.
whole
Luego tenemos en el
process was
2016
abandoned.
un
So
cambio de
then in
comisión, la Comisión
2016,
Juncker,
the EU
que
Commission
elabora
changed.
la
It came under the
estrategia
leadership
de
of
energía
Juncker.
limpia para
They
todos
came
los
up with a clean
europeos
energy
y
strategy
que
for all
mantiene
Europeans
el doble
that
objetivo,
kept
que
up
ya
the
perfila
twofold
los nuevos
objective
actores
and
que van a
outlined
entrar,
some
formar
of
parte
the new players that would take
del
part in
mercado.
the
Luego
market.
tenemos otra nueva comisión en el
And then another
2019,
commission came into
que es
office in
la de la señora
2019,
van der Leyen,
that of
que
Miss van der Leyen.
concreta ya otra
They
transición
outlined
que
another
subsume a la
transition
transición
that
energética,
took over
que
that
es
of
en
the
el
energy
acuerdo
transition, that is the so-called
europeo, la
European
transición
Green Pact,
ecológica. Y
the
ahí
ecological
ya
transition.
eh,
And there,
no se ve el elemento
there was
de
no
las
sign
estrategias de digitalización
of
asociadas a
digitalization strategies
la
associated
transición
with
energética, sino que se
the
llevan
energy
a
transition.
la estrategia general de
They, that was taken
digitalización.
into
Bien,
the
desde
general
entonces, desde ese
digitalization
Pacto
strategy.
Verde, ha habido una
Since that
renovación
Green Pact,
profunda
there has been
del
an in-depth
ordenamiento de la
renewal
energía y
of
del
the legal
clima
framework
en
for energy
Europa.
and
Una
climate
renovación
in Europe.
con sucesivas
This renewal has
modificaciones
undergone a
en
number of
sus
modifications
objetivos y
in its
también
goals
en parte de sus
and also
elementos.
in some of
Entonces,
its
el Fit
elements.
for 55, que
Fit for
incorpora
55,
las
for
estrategias de
example,
hidrógeno,
that has
la reacción
included hydrogen
europea
strategies,
a la
the
invasión
EU's
rusa
reaction to
en
the Russian
Ucrania con el
invasion of Ukraine
repower y la
with
preeminencia
the
de ese
repower
elemento de
strategy
seguridad
and the preeminence
en el
of
abastecimiento frente a todas
security
las
in
demás
energy
que
supply
trae
over
consigo.
all other
Y
priorities.
ya finalmente
And
ahora
now,
la última estrategia
um,
donde
lately,
sobrevive la transición
the latest
energética
strategy
es el
in
plan
the energy
industrial del
transition is
Pacto
the industrial plan
Verde,
as derived from the
en el
Green
que
Pact, the
Europa se
Green
quiere
Deal, in
reindustrializar
which
y
Europe
tener un
is attempting to
liderazgo en
reindustrialize itself
tecnologías
and
de
take a
cero
leadership role
emisiones
in zero
netas. Pues ahí
emissions
estamos. Ese es el
technologies.
proceso de de las estrategias
So that is
políticas.
the outline
La última
of our
modificación en
European
profundidad de todo
energy strategies.
ese ordenamiento es
The
en el
latest landmark
2003,
in this entire legal
donde se
evolution took
incorporan los
place
nuevos objetivos,
in
se
2023
incorporan
with new regulations being
sectores
approved,
nuevos
with
a
new sectors
obligaciones ya
being
existentes. Por
given
ejemplo, esto es muy
existing
importante, el
obligations.
ahorro en
This is very
eficiencia
significant.
energética, que hasta ahora las
Efficiency,
obligaciones
energy savings
específicas,
up to
sobre
now,
todo,
the specific
recaían
obligations fell
en
to,
los
above
sectores
all,
públicos. Ahora
public sector
también
entities.
se les
Now
obliga
they are
a
being
los
rolled out,
operadores a
and
hacer evaluación
operators are
energética
being
antes de
required to do
desplegar sus
energy assessments
decisiones de
before they deploy
inversión, sus
their
proyectos
investment decisions or
de
their
redes,
grid
entre otros.
projects, among
Y
others.
también en ese año,
And that year,
se adopta un reglamento
another set of regulations was approved,
que establece el mecanismo de ajuste de
establishing a
frontera
mechanism
del
for border
carbono,
adjustments for
que pretende
carbon.
neutralizar
The
el
idea is
dumping
to
climático.
neutralize
Es
climate
decir,
dumping.
las desviaciones o la fuga de carbono
Any
o la
deviations or
declaración
carbon
masiva de
leaks or
importación de
the
productos
massive
desde países donde
imports
no tienen
of
una fiscalidad
countries
añadida al
that
carbono
don't
a
have
la Unión
any
Europea. ¿Vale?
tax considerations
Bien,
attached to carbon to
bien,
the
eso lo
EU.
hacemos pues
All of this
con
came under
el
that.
ceremonial
And
europeo con que lo
this
hacemos todo.
coincided
Entró
with
en
all
vigor
of the
en el
European
año
pomp and circumstance.
2023,
It came into force in
pero solo
2023,
para
but
reportar, para dar
only for
obligaciones de a
reporting
quién importa
purposes
esos,
to report on who
esos
was
productos. En
importing
el año
those exo
2024
products. In
se
2024,
incrementan las
there
obligaciones de
was an
reporte a
increase
los
in the reporting
importadores, etcétera,
obligations
etcétera. En el
for
25
importers.
ya hay
In
que inscribirse en
2025,
un registro.
it was
Y
necessary
te dan un
to
número que eso ya
register
completará los
in
documentos
a roll of
aduaneros, etcétera. Y a lo
companies
mejor para el
for
26, a lo mejor para el
customs
26
considerations,
ya
and
empezamos a
maybe
recaudar.
in
¿Vale?
2026 they may
Bien, esto
begin to
Trump lo
collect
hace
some
en 2 semanas.
taxes. President Trump would have done
¿Vale?
this in 2 weeks.
Es lo que tenemos. Y
And
además,
that's just the way we
curiosamente,
are.
es que la lista de
Interestingly
productos
enough,
es
the list of
en
products
gran parte
is
coincidente. Son los
mostly
productos bueno, que son
coincides.
críticos
Well,
para
they're
las
products that are critical
economías,
for
aceros,
economies,
metálicos, químicos orgánicos,
metal, organic
etcétera,
chemicals,
aluminios, etcétera,
aluminum,
etcétera. Y bueno, y aquí pues,
and so forth.
nos lo seguimos pensando. A lo
And
mejor,
Europe is still
no sé,
thinking about it, so to speak,
lo podríamos reconsiderar. Bien, bueno, pues
and
en
reconsidering it,
esos
perhaps.
años el ordenamiento
Over
jurídico
these years,
se ha
the
modificado
legal
en sus
framework
elementos
has
estructurales,
been
es decir,
modified
el
structural
acceso a
terms,
mercados de la energía y la
energy
gobernanza
markets,
a
and
través de ese
governance
instrumento tan interesante
through
como
this very
son los planes
interesting
nacionales
instrument,
integrados de energía
the integrated
y clima
national
y
energy and climate plans
modificación en actuaciones sectoriales, es
and
decir, la
modifications for
directiva de
sector
renovables, la directiva
activities, the directive on
energética,
renewables, that
el
of energy
reglamento
efficiency,
o
regulations,
sea, el régimen de comercio de derechos de
the
emisión,
regimen
etcétera,
for
etcétera. Vale. Y en
commercial
todo
emissions
esto,
rights, and so
¿dónde está
forth.
la regulación del nuevo modelo
With all
energético?
of this, where are the regulations
Pues
for the new energy model?
paradójicamente, la regulación
Ironically
del
enough,
nuevo modelo
the
energético y su
regulation of the new
funcionamiento
energy model and
está
in
en
its
la
operational
regulación del
factors
modelo
is
que
contained in the
quiere dejar
regulations
atrás.
for the models, the model that it
Es
wants
decir,
to
no hay una
abandon.
regulación del nuevo modelo
There
energético,
is
de cómo
no
funcionan los modelos
regulation for the new energy
actuales de
model
una forma
on how these new
sistemática, sino que
players
en
must
la
systematically
directiva del
conduct
mercado de
themselves.
la
In
energía, pues
the energy
incorporan
market directive, there is
los nuevos
included
actores. En
the mention of the new
otras
players.
directivas
In another directive,
incorporan los nuevos
there are
funcionamientos, pero no
included
hay
new ways of operating, but
un
there is not
replanteamiento
one
de cómo
single
funciona el sistema, si se ha
redefinition
creado
of
o
how
no
the
un
system
subsistema
operates.
por
Has a
la
subsystem
cuestión de que
been
pasamos
created
a que son
for
cinco los
these
que
times we are
producen,
going through?
transportan
Are
y
there
distribuyen, a que
five
son cinco
companies
mil,
that produce, transport,
¿vale? A
and
que son
distribute
5.000. Entonces,
to a model
en
in which there are
ese
5,000 who
eh,
produce, transport, and distribute?
eh, mm, eh, a lo que
Therefore,
parece que nos deberíamos
it
de
appears
encaminar
that
es
what
a
we should work toward
estructurar dentro
is
del
a
sistema dos
structuring
subsistemas.
within this
Dos
system, a
subsistemas que
structuring of
coexisten y
subsystems
que
that can
interaccionan
coexist
entre sí.
and interact
Un
among
sistema
themselves.
que ocupa de
A
la
system
generación del
that
transporte
takes
a
responsibility
gran
for
escala para la
generation
gran
and
industria
mass
y para los
transport
nuevos
for major
sectores que van
industry and
apareciendo
for the new
intensivos
sectors that appear, the intensive
en
sectors that
energía,
appear
como es
in
la
energy,
digitalización, gestión de
such
datos
as
y plantas de
digitalization,
hidrógeno,
data
y
management, hydrogen plants,
en
and
paralelo la energía
parallel
ciudadana,
to all of
es
that,
decir, la
citizen
energía
energy,
como un derecho, como una energía de
energy as a right,
proximidad,
energy
limpia,
as
digitalizada,
something
etcétera,
close,
etcétera, etcétera.
clean,
Bien,
digitalized, and so forth.
parece esto, obviamente, además, un modelo donde
Furthermore,
donde
this is a model that places
está
a
muy presente
premium
la
on
circularidad. O sea, en
circularity,
nuestro modelo, el de los
our model, that of
ciudadanos. O sea, es un
citizens,
modelo que en las
a
grandes
model
ciudades donde van a
in which
vivir dos
the
tercios
big
de la población
cities
en el
where
año
two-thirds of the population will live
2050
by
va a
2050
aprovechar la
will
energía de
make the
las
most
infraestructuras de
of the energy from
movilidad para
mobility
alimentar
infrastructures
equipamientos
to
públicos, para atender a
power
situaciones de
public
pobreza
facilities,
energética
to
o satisfacer
remedy
la
energy
demanda de
poverty situations, or
equipamientos
to meet the
de
demand
climatización,
for
que, bueno,
climatization
pues es
facilities,
una vía
which
también
is also
emergente
an emerging
como muy
area
interesante. Es decir,
and a
esto no
very
tiene
interesting
nada
one.
que ver. Entonces,
That
clásicamente en
is,
el
it is
derecho
a
de la energía
completely
dice, hombre,
new
¿cómo
ballgame.
vamos a
In the
diversificar el régimen jurídico
conventional
si esto es
sense,
muy
in the
duro?
classic sense, we could
Ya,
ask,
ya,
how can we
pero el
diversify
agua también es un
this
producto
legal
único y
system
una cosa
for
es el
a
régimen jurídico
unique
del agua
product?
que abres del
Well,
grifo
water is
y otra
also a
cosa
unique
es
product,
el régimen jurídico que no
also
tiene
has
nada que
its
ver
own
del agua de los
legal
regantes, ¿vale?
regime.
Es
The
decir
water that you
que,
get from your
bueno,
faucet at home has nothing to do with the water
esto es
for
duplicidad.
irrigation.
Entonces,
Anyway, there is a certain
eh,
duplicity in all of
¿cuáles
this.
son? Bueno, parece
It
ya
appears
que
now that
hay aspectos
there
muy
are certain
identificados que hay que
clearly
incorporar
identified
al
aspects that have
proceso
to
de
be
transición
incorporated into the
energética
energy
para
transition
que el
process
nuevo modelo
in order
energético sea
for the new
posible
energy
y
model to
para
be
otras cosas
possible
también, a lo mejor para
and
que no haya
for other
apagones.
things to be possible, such as there not being any more
¿Vale?
blackouts.
Entonces, bueno, el tema de el abandono del proceso de
Abandoning
la
the
digitalización se tiene que retomar.
digitalization
Tengo aquí
effort,
varias notas,
I
pero no me
think
da
we
tiempo
need to
de
return to
entrar
that
en ellas
effort.
porque
I
no
have a lot of
quiero
notes on that,
dejar
but I don't want to
de
go into detail on it because I don't
referir
want to leave out
el otro gran reto
the other
regulatorio
major
obviado y
regulatory challenge that has
ignorado,
been
que es
ignored
la
and
cuestión
abandoned.
de
That
las
is
redes.
that
¿Vale?
of grids.
En relación con la digitalización, hay
In the
una
area of
afirmación muy interesante
digitalization,
de la
there's a
Comisión
very
Europea
interesting
en su
statement from the
Plan de
European
Acción de Redes de
Commission in its grid
2023
action plan from
que
2023.
dice
It said the following.
que señala la necesidad imperiosa
It
de
mentioned
intercambio
the clear need
de datos
for the
que es lo que
exchange
genera
of
la
the
digitalización,
data
entendida
generated
de
by
una forma mucho
digitalization,
más amplia
understood in a
a
very
el mero
wide-ranging
control
sense,
de
beyond
los
the mere
consumos, que es lo que le llaman
control or
la
monitoring of
digitalización
consumption, which
de
is
las
what we have,
instalaciones
or the
existentes,
digitalization of
el imperioso
existing
intercambio de
installations, but
información
an
no solo
exchange
entre
of data,
gestores, sino
exchange
entre
of
las partes
information, not
interesadas
just among
del sector
utility
de
management
renovables,
bodies, but
es
the
decir,
stakeholders in
los
renewables.
eh,
That is
entre
among
los consumidores,
the
entre
consumers,
los equipamientos de calefacción y
heating
refrigeración
and
y los
cooling
representantes
facilities and operators,
regionales de
and
la sociedad
regional
civil en la
representatives of civil
preparación
society
de
for
los planes
the
de desarrollo de la red
preparation
de distribución.
of
Esto
distribution
es muy
grid
importante,
development plans.
¿vale?
And this
Nos
is
está
very relevant.
diciendo que ese
This
artículo
is
que
telling
tenemos
us
en la
this
ley
that this
de
article that we have
sector eléctrico
in
de las
the
compañías en
electric
abril de cada
sector
año
law
presentan su
that the
proyecto
companies
de
in April of every year
infraestructuras
have
al
to present
ministerio y la prueba
their
presupuestal.
grid plan
Oye,
to the
no,
ministry
es que
and
no
all
se
of that.
mantiene.
That's not enough
Porque
anymore. It's
evidentemente
not enough
no le
anymore.
puedes pedir
Obviously,
a los
you can't
operadores económicos
ask
que
economic operators
incorporen la
to
previsión de redes que
integrate
requiere la
their
transición energética
forecasts for the
y
grids
todos sus
that will be necessary
equipamientos
for the
y
energy
todos
transition,
sus
as well as for all of their
nuevos
installations,
servicios,
as
¿no?
well as for
Ellos
all of the new
tengan en cuenta
services.
sus
You
inversiones
can't ask
futuritas
them.
y ya está, y lo que van
They,
a,
they take into account their
es decir,
investments
esto
and their
se va a hacer de
profitability
otra manera.
and what they're going to recover.
Y de
In a
hecho,
word, it
en
will have
esa
to be done
comisión,
differently.
en esa
And
comunicación de la
on
Comisión
in that
sobre
statement from
las
the EU Commission
redes,
on
hay
grids,
tendencias ya muy claras desde el
there are
23,
some clear trends
muy
as of
claras que están
2023,
anunciadas
clear trends that have been
como
announced
el
as,
progresivo
for example,
protagonismo de la legislación
a
de la Unión Europea en la
progressive
protección de la
role being
soberanía
played by the European Union and
regulatoria
a
de los
reduction of
estados
regulatory
en materia de
sovereignty
redes,
of member
la
states in grids.
integración de
Also,
las
the
redes y
integration
la
of grids and
coordinación de las
the
ocupaciones de los espacios
coordination of
físicos y por
occupation of physical
integración
spaces.
expresamente
And
menciona
by
la red
integration, they
marítima
specifically
y
mentioned the
terrestre
maritime
y la
and
necesidad
terrestrial
de
grids, also
mantener
the
un
need
exquisito
to
equilibrio
maintain
geográfico
perfect
para
geographic
evitar
balance
desestabilizaciones de oferta.
to prevent and
Y
avoid
por
any
último,
destabilization of offer. And last,
el
as
principio de
regards
eficiencia
grids,
energética. Es decir,
the
la
principle of
comisión ya
energy
que se han dado
efficiency.
cuenta de los 11
They
cuánto
have
vale
realized how
reparar
much it costs to
o
repair
mejorar los 11
or
millones de kilómetros
improve those
de redes
11
en
million
Europa y
kilometers
proveer
of
unas
grids in
redes
Europe and
que
to provide
van a
the
demandar
grids
la
that will be
nueva
required
generación y dices,
by
ah, pero si
the new
tenemos los
generation
principios de
needs.
eficiencia
And now
energética.
they are
¿Y qué dice
remembering
el principio
the
de
old
eficiencia
energy
energética?
efficiency
Desde
principle.
el
What does
año
that principle tell
2012 que
us?
no se le
That
hace ni
since
caso en
2012,
en la directiva de eficiencia
it has been
energética.
ignored.
Oiga, antes
Energy
de
efficiency has been ignored.
hacer
It tells us
expansión,
before you
evalúe
expand,
usted el
evaluate
potencial local
the
que
local
tiene
potential that
de
you
lo
have
residual, de energía
of
residual
residual
que no se
heat,
aprovecha
residual
de
energy
los
that is
procesos
not used
industriales, de la movilidad
for industrial uses,
urbana,
for
de los
mobility,
puntos de
urban
depuración de aguas
mobility,
residuales, etcétera, etcétera.
wastewater
Más
treatment, and
renovables.
so
Haga
forth,
usted
more
un
renewables.
análisis coste-beneficio
Do a
para
cost-benefit
ver si es
analysis of all of
rentable
that to
aprovechar
see
esa
if it's profitable
energía
to use
disponible
that
y si
available
no lo
energy.
es,
And if it's
esto usted lo
not,
hace
but you
conforme a
need
las
to do this
recomendaciones detalladísimas
according
que hay en la
to
directiva
very
para
specific
analizar
instructions in the
coste
directive to
beneficios, que
analyze
por cierto,
cost
en la
benefits,
última
which, by the
modificación,
way,
en
in the
los
latest
costes han
modification,
incluido
in
también
costs,
los
they've
costes de salud
included
y los ambientales.
health and
¿Vale?
environmental costs.
Una buena
So
noticia.
that's good news.
Bien, y entonces, si no es rentable, pues entonces ya sí,
If
ya
it's
hace
not
usted una
profitable,
expansión de
then
red.
you can
Entonces,
expand the grid.
esto lo está diciendo
This is being said,
el
this is all being
Consejo
said
de
by the
Cooperadores, de Reguladores
Council of
Europeos. Y lo ha dicho recientemente.
Cooperationists and
¿Cómo
Regulators of Europe.
reducimos necesidades de
How
financiación?
to
Pues
reduce
de esa
financing
manera.
needs?
En ese
This is how
contexto,
we
¿qué
do it.
relevancia tienen
In
las
that
comunidades energéticas?
context, what is the relevance of energy
Porque
communities?
aseguran
They
el
are
consumo
absolutely
de
relevant because they ensure
proximidad a través de sus propias
close consumption through their own
redes,
grids.
proveen
They
beneficios al
provide
sistema en su
benefits to the
conjunto. Ayer se
system
habló
overall.
de esto, de la
Yesterday, this
característica
was
de
mentioned,
proveer
the
beneficios no
characteristic of
financieros
providing
a los participantes
non-financial
de
benefits to
las
the
comunidades energéticas. Esto
participants
también lo es.
of energy
Esto
communities, and that is also the case.
también lo es. O sea, los beneficios
It is also the
no
case.
financieros no
The
son solo
non-financial
becas para
benefits are
los
not
hijos de
just
los
financial
participantes
aid
o
for the children
residencias
of community members
de mayores. Es que
or
precisamente
for
las comunidades energéticas
elder
operan en el
residential
mercado. ¿Para qué
facilities.
operan en el mercado? Para ganar
The
dinero.
energy
¿Y
communities are
ese
on the
dinero qué
market.
hacen?
Why are they on the market?
Menos
To make money.
repartirlo entre los participantes,
And
cualquier cosa. Pues un distrito
they can do
de
anything with that money
refrigeración que nos
except
va a ir
distribute it among its members. They can
haciendo
set up
falta,
refrigeration districts
o
which are
cualquier otro
necessary or cooling districts
servicio
or any
energético. Y
other
además, si
energy service.
computamos
And
el
if you
beneficio
take into
al
account
sistema en
the
términos
benefits
de
for the system
inversiones que
in terms
ahorra
of investments that make for a
en
savings
red y las
in the grid
pérdidas en
and
red, bueno,
losses,
pues
cut losses in the
entonces,
grid.
si eso es así, o sea,
If
con
that is
ese
the case,
razonamiento, todos
with
esos
that
intereses cualificados
approach,
que estamos
all
viendo
of
que
those
emergen
qualified
en el marco
interests
de la
that
transición
emerge
energética
in the
y se
framework of
dice
the energy
esto
transition
es de interés
and
público superior y
say
por lo
this is
tanto
of
la legislación
greater public
ambiental pues se
interest
va a
and
quedar
therefore
así como un
environmental
poquito
legislation
tocada.
will
O
be
en el
impacted.
caso de
Or
algunos
in the
proyectos,
case of
esto
certain
es
projects,
proyecto de
this is a
interés
project of
europeo
European
en
interest
proyectos concretos, por
in
ejemplo, de
specific
hidrógeno,
projects. For example, hydrogen.
y por lo
Therefore,
tanto vamos a entrar en los procesos de
we're going
concesión
to
directa de la Ley
get
General de
into the
Subvenciones
processes of direct
y no los
concession
vamos
of the Subsidies
a
Act,
someter a
and we're going
concurrencia.
to
Es decir, si eso es así,
have
habrá
a
cuestiones que
tender.
se han considerado que sí, que
If
son
this is the
interés
case,
cualificado, como
as
las
it appears to be
renovables
the
y el
case,
hidrógeno y tal, no sé qué,
qualified
bien,
interests,
con todos esos beneficios
hydrogen,
de las
and so
comunidades
forth,
energéticas,
with all of those benefits from the
como
energy
no se le
communities,
reconoce también
how could they
un
not
interés
also recognize
cualificado. En
qualified
definitiva,
interest? In short,
eh, ya termino, ¿no?
and I am wrapping up, aren't I?
Bueno, en definitiva, que no nos
Anyway,
pase, este auditorio es
in
muy
short,
joven, como aquella
this
película
auditorium
de
is full of young people,
Bienvenido
just like
Mr. Marshall,
that
que lo podemos pasar
film. Welcome, Mr. Marshall.
adelante.
Bienvenidos, Mr.
vamos
Marshall,
a
where the
seguir los que
townspeople
tenemos
saw
sensibilidad
Mr. Marshall
por
drive right through their town
este
without
tema,
stopping.
el levantar el
Let's
dedito de
be
y lo
aware of
mío
all of
qué,
this
y lo mío qué, porque,
and be able
bueno, pues
to
a
raise our
día de
hands
hoy,
and ask, what about me?
evidentemente hay un
What
desarrollo
about my
de
bit?
la transición
Obviously, there has been
energética
a great development of energy development
espectacular
of
en
the energy
términos
transition that has
de
been spectacular
inversión en
in
renovables y
investment in
grandes
renewables and
y
major
grandes
projects
instalaciones. Dices, bueno,
and
y todo lo
major
demás,
installations and
pues vamos a
facilities.
tener que ir
Everything
reduciendo
else
porque, quiero decir,
will
el
just have to
desequilibrio
repeat the process because the
es
imbalance
muy importante a
is
día de hoy
very
y bueno,
significant as
pero
of
como
today.
parece que las comunidades
But
energéticas van a
as
ser
it
rentables
appears
en
that
este
energy
segundo
communities
Consejo de
will
Reguladores
be
Europeos
profitable
y
according
que
to the
ahora
Council of European
inversiones
Regulators
renovables pues
because they
igual por ahí
save investments
esperemos
in
suerte
grids.
y se
We
generan.
may
Bueno,
be
muchas gracias.
lucky, and that may be the solution. Thank you for your attention.
No, yo en el centro, no, vamos una esquinita, ¿no? Me pongo en una esquina. Yo creo que en el orden. Creo que- Hola, pero- Buen día, buenos días, buongiorno, guten Morgen, good morning. Muchas gracias a todos por
Thank
la
you
asistencia.
to one and all
Y
for
bueno,
your
no puedo
attendance
antes de
here
empezar dar
today.
las
Of course,
gracias a los
I have to
profesores
begin
Chocollo
by
y a la
thanking
profesora
Professors
Galera
Chocolio and
por
Galera,
invitarme a participar en su día en el
Professors
proyecto, de lo
Cochiolo and
cual estoy muy
Galera for inviting
agradecida.
me to
Y
take
por
part in this
supuesto
project.
voy
I'm
a
very
moderar
grateful for
esta
that and for
fantástica mesa
inviting
con
me
motivo de
to
participar
chair
en este
this
congreso.
roundtable
Bien,
discussion and for
sin más, vamos
participating
a
in this
empezar, ¿de
Congress
acuerdo?
overall. So
Tenemos
let's get
cuatro
underway.
ponentes,
We have four
así que
speakers,
vamos a empezar con la
and
mesa que se
today we're
llama
going to
Retos
start with
regulatorios
this
de las
roundtable
comunidades
discussion.
energéticas en España.
Regulatory
Le doy la
challenges for
palabra al
communities, energy
doctor Román
communities in
Muguer,
Spain.
por favor, gracias.
So let's get underway by giving the floor to
Ciao
Dr.
a tutti.
Romain Malguer.
Muchas gracias.
Okay, thank
Gracias
you.
efectivamente primero a
I'd like
los y las
to
organizadoras del evento, a Enriu,
thank
Susana, pero
the
también
organizers,
Laura
Susana,
y Alba.
Professor Cocciolo,
Entonces les voy a hablar un
and
rato.
everyone who has invited me
Para que
today. I
no
will be
sea demasiado
speaking
extenso,
for a
de
while. I
comunidades
hope it's not
energéticas,
too
de
long,
almacenamiento y de
talking about
flexibilidad.
energy communities, storage, and
Antes algunas palabras
flexibility.
sobre el
Before,
centro
just a
donde estoy
few words
trabajando. En este
on
caso
my
es un centro
center.
relativamente
In
nuevo.
this
Es
case,
el
it's a
Centro
relatively
Ibérico
new
de
center, the
Investigación
Iberian
en Uso
Center
Eléctrico de la
for
Universitat
Research in
situado
Energy
concretamente sobre
Storage,
Cáceres.
located in
Como ustedes pueden
Cáceres.
ver,
And as you
somos
can
ya como
see,
más de 100
there are
investigadores,
over 100
muchos
researchers there,
científicos,
many
como decía, gente de
scientists,
bata blanca y
people
unos
wearing
cuantos
lab
haciendo
coats,
derecho. Como pueden ver
and
aquí, estamos trabajando sobre
we're also
almacenamiento energético de
working
varias
on
maneras,
energy storage in
baterías,
different ways,
hidrógeno, almacenamiento
batteries,
térmico, todo temas así más
hydrogen, thermal
técnicos, pero
storage.
también
Those are the more
tenemos una
technical
cierta,
details, but
unas unidades
we also have some
horizontales,
units,
transversales,
horizontal
que
or
trabajamos con los
transversal
diferentes
units
pilares,
that
incluso
work
el
with
que
these
es aquí de
different pillars,
regulation, que es la parte legal.
and
Entonces, simplemente es un
including
reporte que se
regulation.
presentó ayer y también
And we
hacemos
saw a
las
presentation from that
análisis,
unit
etcétera.
yesterday on energy analysis and
Para centrar
other
el tema. Entonces,
aspects.
hablaré un poquito del
Now,
contexto español
as
en el cual
for
se está
the
desarrollando el
Spanish
almacenamiento de
context
energía
in
o se podría
terms of
desarrollar
energy
el
storage,
almacenamiento de la energía por las comunidades energéticas,
how it could be
algunos
done
aspectos muy
in energy
básicos
communities,
sobre la
a few
legislación de la Unión
basic
Europea y
details
después
on EU
la legislación
legislation,
estatal
and
española
then
en estos
Spanish
campos.
legislation will be
Antes de
discussed,
resaltar algunos elementos que todavía
and then
están
a few things that
ausentes.
are still lacking.
Como sabemos,
As
España
we
tiene un
know,
alto potencial de
Spain
renovables, de
has a
energías
lot of
renovables, y
potential
uno lo dice
for
el PNIEC o
renewable
el
energy. And as we
IPCC
say
inglés, para
in the
2030 tenemos unos
ENPC,
objetivos de casi
by
50% de
2030, it
renovables
should be
en
over
el uso final
50%
de energía,
renewables in the
80%
final
en
energy
industria
uses, or
eléctrica,
80% of
y
electrical generation.
un objetivo de más
And
de 500
the goal
gigavatios de almacenamiento, incluyendo almacenamiento solar
of
termoeléctrico. Aquí pueden ver algunas cifras. Entre 2020 y
some
2030, la eólica debería
in
casi
by
se
2030, wind
duplicar,
energy should
la fotovoltaica
practically
multiplicará por 7
double.
casi en 10
Photovoltaic should be
años, y
multiplied by
puede ser
7 in
casi
10
más o menos
years.
en camino, aunque bueno,
It's
hay dudas
more
sobre
or
si se
less
podrá realmente lograr o no,
on
visto que hay
track to be the
precios
case.
negativos y ese tipo de cosas que
It seems
pasan en el
there are
mercado en
some
términos de la
negative
remuneración de
values
estos
that occur
activos.
on the
Y
market
bajo
and
el
the remuneration
experimento
of
en
these
2020 vimos
assets. And by
aquí
storage
poniendo
2020,
algunos, ya, 6 gigavatios, pero las
6
cifras son bastante,
gigawatts.
digamos, dudosas, porque cuando
But
uno
these
ve sobre
figures
red
are
eléctrica, el TSO, solo
not very
sale
reliable
3 gigavatios,
because
como
according
veremos
to Red
después.
Electrica,
Pero
the
bueno, con un
distributor is only
objetivo de
3, but
triplicar
the goal
esa
is
capacidad de
to triple
almacenamiento,
that
por
storage
ejemplo, para
capacity in
evitar
any event
apagones.
to
Se ve que
prevent
estamos todavía con un
blackouts,
poquito de trabajo
which
sobre
is
este tema.
something
Aquí, como
we are
pueden ver,
talking about
este mes
recently.
hay
This
principalmente
month,
bombeo,
there has been pumping
que es
for the most
para
part
almacenamiento, unos 3 gigavatios, ¿no?
for storage, some 3 megawatts
Hydropower, y unos 25
hydropower
megavatios
and
solamente
25
de baterías
megawatts of
conectadas y
battery
reconocidas como tal
connected
a
and
la red.
recognized as such, connected
Ahora,
to the grid.
otros elementos de contexto, hay problemas de
Other parts
estabilidad
of the
para las
context,
renovables,
there are problems
tenemos
for
también problemas de
exemptions in
aceptabilidad que están
renewables,
empezando a
also
salir para las baterías mismas, las grandes baterías,
acceptability
por ejemplo en
of
Asturias.
renewables and batteries. For example, here we see the
Tuvimos el
case of
apagón que
Asturias.
plantea esta
We
cuestión
had
urgente
the
de la
blackout
resiliencia
that
del
brought to
sistema
light
energético,
the
y
need
las
for greater
comunidades
resilience
pueden
in our
aparecer
energy
como
system, and
partes de
communities
la solución,
can
no
be
como la
part of the
solución,
solution, not
pero
as
como
the solution,
elementos
but
de
as
la solución.
elements that form part of the
Ahora,
solution.
algunas cifras también sobre
Now,
el
a
almacenamiento
couple
para las
figures on
comunidades.
storage for
Específicamente, cuando hablamos
energy
de tamaños de
communities in
almacenamiento,
terms of
para una casa
storage
individual hablamos
sizes
de unos
for
10
an
kilovatios
individual
horas,
home.
más o
It's
menos de
10
batería.
kilowatts an
Para una
hour, more or
comunidad
less, of battery.
energética puede ser de 10 a 100
For a
kilovatios
community, it
horas.
can be
Si
from
realmente tenemos una comunidad que es
10 to
bien
50.
ambiciosa,
If
quisiera
it is a
irse a
community
valores
that is
superiores,
very
tiene también
ambitious and
sus
wants to work at a higher
businesses, algunos
level,
comercios
and with some
dentro de la comunidad,
businesses
podríamos hablar
within
de
the
hasta un
community,
megavatio
it
hora,
could even be
potencialmente en
1
algunos
megawatt
casos que
per
todavía
hour.
no
In
realmente
some
están y
cases
podrían
that don't
tenerlo.
really exist yet, but they could exist.
En términos de estimaciones de las
In terms
instalaciones
of
existentes y las que
the
están por
estimates
venir,
for
a
existing
finales del
installation, by
24
the end of
teníamos más de 8
2024, we
gigavatios
had over 8
y en
gigawatts
autoconsumo
of
en España,
PV
y hay una
self-consumption in
estimación del
Spain,
sector que
and
es
the
que
estimate for the
10% tiene
sector,
baterías. Eso es
10%
behind the
had
meter, no detrás del
batteries
contador, ¿no?
behind
Entonces,
the meter, so to speak.
hay un estudio de 2023, ese es un estudio
It,
del 2023,
this
perdón,
is from
del
2023, excuse
10%,
me, this
pero una
10%,
fuente
but
otro habla del
another
70% de las
source talked about
instalaciones de
as many as
autoconsumo del
70% of the
2024 que tenían una
self-consumption
batería
installations
detrás
of
del contador.
2024 had a battery
No
behind the
sé, esta
meter.
cifra me parece
I don't know, but these figures seem very high to me. The
Y
sector
es un
is
sector
evolving
sobre todo no hay
quickly.
mucha cifra
It's a
oficial.
sector where there's not much
Difícil saber
official
realmente lo que dice
data.
el
It's
contador.
hard to know what's behind the
Pero
meter.
en 2024 también
But
se habla
by
de
2024, they're talking
155
about
megavatios horas de baterías
156 megawatts
instaladas,
hour
el
of
60%
installed
en el sector
batteries,
industrial,
70% in the
en el
industrial
cual
sector,
han puesto
in
las comunidades
which
energéticas para los
they
que
had
se
established energy communities
corrían también en
for those that
2022
have
con
done the
60 megavatios
SEGAF
horas. Bueno,
2023
al total podríamos llegar
total
dentro de un par de
could
años en
be
términos de
in a couple
almacenamiento detrás
years
del
the
contador como 1
storage
gigavatio
behind the
horas.
meter of
El
1
problema es
gigawatt
que
per
estas son
hour.
baterías que
The problem is
típicamente
these
no
are
están
batteries that typically
pensadas
are
y
not conceived
calibradas para ayudar
or
al sistema, son mucho
calibrated
más
to
para
help the system.
autoconsumo.
They're much more for
Entonces es una
self-consumption.
oportunidad perdida
Therefore,
realmente de
it's
poder
an
usarles
opportunity that has been
más en
lost
términos de,
to
bueno,
use
estamos
them
consumiendo
more
recursos
for,
materiales
well,
para
we're
fabricarlas,
consuming
podríamos usar
material
recursos
resources
mucho más
to make them.
para temas de
We could use
resiliencia de
them
la
more
red,
for
para
grid
rentabilizarlas más, pero no se
resilience
hace porque
or make
el marco
profitable
legal no lo
the grid.
permite o no lo
And
incentiva
it's because the
suficientemente,
legal
que
framework
es
does
el
not
punto
allow
que
it.
voy a venir ahora.
And that is what
También
I'm
hay
going to speak
formas
to
de
now.
subvención
There are
nacionales,
also problems in
cómo se
subsidies
implementa, las
and how they are
convocatorias
implemented.
tercera y cuarta que se han resuelto en 2023
There have been
pedían, no, algunas permitían
cases
la
in
instalación de algo de
2023
almacenamiento, pero no medio
requesting
megavatio hora,
more
y las
installation
quintas y
for
sextas convocatorias que se han dado hace ya
storages.
más de 6 meses y que todavía
The
no están
sixth and
resueltas,
seventh tenders
ponen como requisito
have not
obligatorio para las
been
comunidades
concluded,
energéticas para
have
recibir estas subvenciones
a requisite
de
to
instalar
receive the
almacenamiento con equipos de
subsidies
renovables
to
eléctricas.
establish
Entonces también
storage.
se va aquí esparciendo más
Therefore,
en el
there is a
sistema.
greater distribution throughout the system.
Ahora, sobre la flexibilidad, cuando hablamos de
As for
flexibilidad,
flexibility,
es la
when it
capacidad de
comes to
ajustar la
flexibility,
generación o
it's the
el consumo de tu zona,
capacity
¿no?
to
De un lado y del
adjust
otro para equilibrar siempre
consumption
el
to
sistema.
generation.
Hay varios tipos de
There
servicios
are
de
a number
flexibilidad, no entra
of
dentro de
models
esto.
for flexibility. I won't
Hay
speak to
varias
each of them.
tecnologías que pueden ofrecer
There are
flexibilidad. Hemos
technologies that
visto
can
ahora lo
offer
del percohidro
flexibility.
o el
We've seen the
bombeo
hydro plan, the
las
pumping
baterías obviamente, pero también la
batteries,
carga inteligente de
obviously,
los
but
coches
also
eléctricos, por
smart
ejemplo.
charging
Hay diferentes
for
necesidades de
electric
flexibilidad que van
vehicles. There are
evolucionando entre
other
como creo que
needs
el
for
2021-2030.
flexibilization that will evolve
Vemos como
between 20 and
la
2030.
necesidad diaria de
We will
flexibilidad se
see
multiplica por
the
3 y aumenta un
need for
poco,
flexibility
no dentro
multiplying
de
by
los
3.
mismos,
It is increasing
no
a
del mismo
little,
empleo para la flexibilidad
but
a nivel de
not
temporada, no de varios meses. Al
enough
final necesitamos más
for
flexibilidad.
the
Y
seasonal
las comunidades
flexibility.
energéticas pueden agregar
Energy
recursos
communities can
flexibles
add
a nivel
flexible
de un barrio o
resources
de un pueblo
to a
y
neighborhood
ofrecer
or
en
town.
principio servicios en el mercado. Pero para eso hay que
To do
fijarse en la
so,
regulación. Y no solamente en la
there must
regulación del
also be a
almacenamiento, porque es
flexibilization
como
of
una red
regulations, but not just on storage.
de
It is
regulaciones
like a grid
que
of
están jugando las
or
unas
network
para
of
las otras. Y si
regulations
tenemos
that have
un muy buen régimen del
interaction,
almacenamiento puramente
and
hablando, pero
there's
no un
a
buen régimen, por
good
ejemplo, de
legal
la
system
agregación,
for storage,
tendremos
but
un problema
not
porque estamos
for
cerrando muchas
bundling,
puertas. Y es lo que
and
está pasando.
therefore
Entonces
there are
aquí
many
he ido
ways in and out of these
repasando las
networks.
regulaciones a nivel
There,
estatal de
I've been looking
almacenamiento,
at the
autoconsumo
regulations
colectivo,
at the
servicios de
state level
flexibilidad,
for
respuesta de
storage,
demanda,
collective
agregación
self-consumption,
y
flexibility
definición de agregación
services,
independiente,
response to
comunidades
demand,
enérgicas y acceso
independent
a
bundling,
mercados
energy
para estos
communities, and
sectores.
access to markets.
La regulación europea, ya lo hemos
European
hablado ayer, así que no voy
regulation, this
a
was
hablar
spoken about
mucho
yesterday,
de
so I
esto,
won't
pero
go into
está
detail on this.
poniendo todas
But
las definiciones de
here you
cómo es
see
distribuido
some of the
estos tipos de
definitions of these
actores
different
y de actividades.
layers and
Y
activities.
como elemento principal, las
And as
comunidades
the main
energéticas tienen el derecho
element,
a
energy
operar instalaciones de
communities have the right
almacenamiento, eso
to
también lo
operate
escuchamos ayer,
storage
a
installations. We
ofrecer
heard about
servicios
this
de
yesterday,
flexibilidad
to
y
offer
acceder a todos los
flexibility
mercados
services
eléctricos
and
relevantes
access all
directamente
relevant
o vía
electric
agregación.
markets
Eso, de
directly or
momento, es un
through
poco más
bundling.
la
This
teoría que
is
la realidad para lo que pasa en
more
España, porque
theory than
tenemos este
reality.
retraso de transposición, que tiene que transponerse todo para junio
This
2021
is,
y
there's
hay
also been a
partes que
delay in the
todavía no están
transposition. It should have been done by
transpuestas en
June 2021,
2025.
but
No
there
digo
are still
todo,
parts that
pero
have not
algunas
been
partes
transposed by
de las
2025,
regulaciones.
some parts of these regulations.
Ahora, moviéndonos a la legislación española
Looking
estatal
at
sobre estos
Spanish
temas.
legislations,
Entonces, el almacenamiento está definido casi como en la
storage
legislación de la Unión Europea,
is
solo sobre
defined
el uso final como otro
as
vector
in EU
energético, también
legislation.
aplica para hidrógeno, que no está en la definición en español.
Hydrogen is
Está
not included in the
considerado
Spanish
el
definition. It is
almacenamiento
considered,
como
storage is
generación para lo
considered
que va de acceso a la
as
red y las
generation for access to the
autorizaciones
network
administrativas, pero una batería también va a tener
and
que
grid,
pedir permiso de
but
demanda,
a
como está
battery will have
considerado también. O
to
sea, está considerado como generación, pero
request
tiene que
demand
practicar a los
permission
dos para realmente poder estar conectada y actuar. Tú dirás más sobre esto, yo creo, Alejandro. Y hay una extensión de
And
permisos de
there's
acceso a la red
also
para
an
activar el
extension of
autoconsumo
permits for
en el
access to
almacenamiento
the
cuando
grid
no hay
for
excedentes vertidos a la
self-consumption
red o con excedentes, pero
when
hasta
there's not an
15
excess in the grid,
kilovatios horas en
or
terrenos urbanizados. Entonces, típicamente para una pequeña
this could
instalación de behind the
typically
meter.
be for behind the meter
Como hemos
installation,
visto, si son un
as
poco
we've
más
seen.
importantes estas instalaciones como para comunidades energéticas, entonces aquí
These
es más
interactions are
difícil
more
estar dentro de
significant
ese tipo de
in energy
exenciones. No hay
communities,
pago de
so it would
peajes ni
fit
de
within
cargos en estos
this
casos,
regulation. There's
y
no
les dan garantías
fees
económicas
or
también
charges
para
and
aplicar
economic
para
guarantees
estaciones de demanda de electricidad han sido reducidas a la mitad para evitar ese tipo de
to
dobles
for
pagos como hay
electricity
con
demand
garantías
installations
para generación, para demanda
for
al mismo
generation
tiempo.
and demand at the same
En términos
time.
de autoconsumo colectivo, la actividad también está definida y
In
regulada
terms
desde
of
2019.
self-consumption, this has
Hasta
been
100
also regulated
kilovatios,
from
los
2019
actores pueden acceder
until
a la
100
compensación
kilowatts.
simplificada que el
The
sistema de net
players can access
metering
to this
en
simplified
España.
compensation,
Hay
a
la
system of net
pregunta
metering
siempre
in
de la
Spain, and there's always the
distancia entre
question
los
of the distance
consumidores,
between
que en
consumers.
este caso el elemento
In this
principal es
case,
este de máximo
the main
500
event is
metros
this
que
that
se puede
appears
extender
here,
hasta 2
maximum
kilómetros cuando
500
hablamos
meters,
de
with an
PV
extension of 2
estudiantil,
kilometers
rooftop
when we
PV,
talk of
o
covered
en suelo industrial, que es
EV,
lo que se suele dar, pero es mucho
photovoltaic,
menos que lo que
or
hemos visto en
industrial
Francia
solar.
ayer, 10 a 20 kilómetros.
And yesterday we
Es
talked
un
about
aspecto que, bueno,
10 to
necesita
20
estudiar este
kilometers.
tipo de área.
So
Podría
we
ser
would
ampliar,
like
porque
to
especialmente
extend
para zonas más rurales
this
es un poco
distance
difícil, digamos.
because in the case of rural areas, it's
El
more
almacenamiento
complicated.
está explícitamente autorizado también para
Storage
hacer
is
autoconsumo
authorized
colectivo, lo que
for
también da un poco de
collective
claridad. Y una
self-consumption
comunidad energética
operations,
puede organizar el
and
autoconsumo
an energy
y
community can
representar a los
organize the
consumidores.
self-consumption and
Entonces hay realmente un
represent the
vínculo que se está
consumers.
haciendo entre estas dos
So this
figuras
is the linkage
jurídicas.
that we are doing between
Hablando de
these two legal
flexibilidad,
entities.
apenas
Talking
entramos en el
about
derecho español,
flexibility,
la noción misma de
it
flexibilidad,
doesn't appear
en el
much
derecho
in
europeo ha
the
tomado realmente
Spanish law.
tiempo en ser
And
definida
in the case
y
of the
tiene realmente
European
nombre
legislation,
propio.
it has
En el
also
decreto del
taken
2019
time
ya se
to be
mencionaba, se
defined.
definirse más. Y ahora con la última reforma del
And now
mercado
with the
eléctrico
last
hay más elementos
reform
ya a nivel
of
europeo
the
sobre la
electric market,
flexibilidad
it
por fin.
appears more in the
Pero
case
los
of the European
componentes de la
legislation, but
flexibilidad
the
sí que son
components of
más
this
desarrollados
flexibility are more developed,
y están también en los planes para nuevos
and
desarrollos
they appear
legales
also
que
in
se
the
incluye
plans
en
for
el TIEC.
new legal
La
developments.
respuesta de la demanda está definida
Response to
legalmente
demand
como
is
gestión
defined
de la
legally
demanda y no
like
respuesta de la
the
demanda, con
management
la
of
demanda
demand and not
desde el
response to
2013 en el
demand.
sector eléctrico. Principalmente cuando hablamos de gestión de la
And
demanda
mainly when
eléctrica en
we
España
talk about
hablamos de
managing demand,
sostenibilidad,
we talk
servicio
about
de
the
respuesta activa
service
de la demanda, el
of
SRAD,
not
desde
stopping
el
the grid.
2000, bueno, que está establecido y definido normalmente
And
por
it has been
la resolución del
established and
2023.
defined
Pero
by
solo para
the
ofertas de
resolution
mínimo de
of
1 megavatio hora,
2023, but
entonces 1
also
megavatio hora,
only
perdón.
for supply with a
Entonces
minimum of
es
1
un
megawatt.
sistema que está pensado
This
para
is a
grandes
system that has
consumidores
been thought
industriales, no
for
realmente para los pequeños
big
actores, ¿no?
consumers,
Es un
industrial
umbral que debe de
consumers,
ser
and not for
rebajado a
small
ofertas desde
players.
100
And this
kilovatios,
should
pero
be
todavía no está
reduced
hecho.
to 100 kilowatts, but this
Y
hasn't
está
been
muy
done yet.
vinculado eso con la
This
agregación.
is
La
very
agregación es realmente
related
un
to the
elemento fundamental
aggregation.
porque sí quiere
This is
decir que
some
tenemos muchas
fundamental
pequeñas
element because we
instalaciones,
have
tenemos que poder
small
agregarlas
installations
en
and
solo
we
un,
need to be able to
podemos decir, como si
aggregate them
fuese artificialmente, pero como si fuese un solo proveedor
as if
de
this was one
flexibilidad
only
de la generación
supplier
o
of
de la demanda.
flexibility.
Entonces, por eso es un papel tan importante en el
Therefore,
sistema en el cual es difícil
this is
realmente
very
activar
important in a
estas
system in which it
fuentes,
is
estos
complicated
recursos
to
de
activate
flexibilidad.
these
Entonces,
flexibility
la actividad de
resources.
agregación y el rol
The
de
aggregation
agregador independiente
and
han sido
the
definidos en
role of the
2020.
independent
Es una actividad que
aggregators
incluye el
were defined in
almacenamiento
2020. This includes
y el
storage,
rol requiere que un agregador
and
sea
the role
independiente de la
requires that this
comercializadora del
aggregator is
cliente.
independent from the
También se
commercializer
autoriza en este
of the
régimen a las
customer.
comunidades energéticas a
This
acceder al
regime
mercado a
also
través de la
allows the
agregación
energy
o a
communities to
proponer
access
servicios de
markets
agregación
through this
ellas
aggregation
mismas.
or
Se abre también una puerta al
propose
gasto
these
simple de
services of
gestión para ese tipo
aggregation.
de
So this is
rol.
an important opportunity
Esta
for this role.
explícitamente
And
vinculada
this
al
is
almacenamiento,
linked
esta
to the
actividad de
storage,
agregación para ofrecer
these
servicios de
aggregation
respuesta de
activities,
demanda.
to
Por
offer
ejemplo, pero
services
realmente
of
falta un
responding to the
régimen
demand. But
legal más
there's
detallado. Faltan
still
muchos detalles para
lacking
que realmente
a
puedan haber
detailed
agregadores
regime. We
independientes que
need
casi
more
no hay en
details
España
because
o de muy pequeño
there
nivel
are a
o que
few
es que no
aggregators
está
in
claro
Spain
el régimen
because
legal para
the
poder
legal
acceder a
regime
los
is not clear
mercados
to
y
access
usar
how
estos
to access the market.
recursos de flexibilidad.
and using these flexibility resources. So moving on to the energy communities, they have been defined since 2020, but their regime doesn't mention the storage or any other flexibility activity. When we talk about the renewable energy communities, and in the case of the citizen energy communities defined from 2023, they don't mention either storage or flexibility, but it includes the right to access the energy markets, including through aggregation or representing consumers in operations of collective self-consumption. Since 2023, it includes the reference to storage in activities for the renewable energy communities, but not in the case of the citizen energy communities. So this is a bit complex, and it's a pity that it doesn't appear inside the two legal entities at the same time. Access to the market. This is a main aspect. There's a general principle, the right to access energy markets in a non-discriminatory way, individually or through aggregation. This comes from the law of 2013, but there are practical barriers for the flexibility resources at small scale. This is what we were saying before. The storage facilities can access balanced markets. They have the right to do so. They can offer services in technical restrictions, replacement reserves, all these systems that start working to avoid things like blackouts. So there were probably some mistakes from that side when there was the blackout here in Spain. The aggregation of small units is possible, but since the regime of the aggregator hasn't been established yet, this isn't happening at the moment. And meanwhile, the energy communities are limited to increment their self-consumption rate and offer these high prices and low prices inside the same day. This is what they can only do, and this is a pity because they have much potential on how these equipments could be used. There's also a delay in the implementation of local markets of flexibility in Spain. What's missing then? We need a detailed regime for the independent aggregation. There was a proposal of Royal Decree in 2024, but it hasn't been adopted. The grid planned the participation of independent aggregators for March 2025, but this hasn't happened. And the blackout wasn't an excuse because this was before. Flexibility markets should accept offers starting from 100 kilowatts. We need new flexibility markets. For example, the primary regulation market, which is the one that starts up front. This is obligatory and non-remunerated for the generators. This is how this worked before. But if we need to create new markets like batteries that can respond in very few time, we need to create these new markets. And this can be included here. We need more flexibility local markets, and we still need to regulate the distributed storage non-associated to self-consumption. Practical problems with the storage behind the meter. It's impossible to use the payment exception of tolls for batteries. And there's uncertainty when it comes to exemption in the payment of fees over the energy consumed. And to wrap up, we see this strong progression of renewables in Spain. there's an increase in hours at the price 0 or negative. This is a problem for the profitability of the sector and for the development of new capacities. Energy communities are part of the solution. They can install batteries, small or medium batteries, but there are still lacking many legal developments. There has been a lot of efforts in that sense, but we still need more key elements. Like, for example, the detailed regime for the independent aggregators, real access to the market, and we still need to learn more. Thank you for your attention, and I'm sorry for having spoken so fast. Thank you very much for your presentation, Roma. And now the floor goes to Professor Estrella Gutiérrez and Vanessa Jiménez. Can you hear me? Now, perfect. My presentation here, okay, perfect. Okay, fantastic. So we will do this together. First of all, we wanted to thank both of us, the directors of this Congress, Andrew Scotrolo and Susana Galera, for having invited us to participate in this project. My name is Vanessa Jiménez. My colleague is Estrella Gutiérrez, professor and doctor of the Universitat Complutense. I'm from the Universitat de Salamanca, and since we only have 20 minutes to talk about a wide topic, we will start. We had to talk about a topic that Professor Galera has also mentioned, which is digitalization, and we will link it to other aspects that have also been mentioned in other panels. When we talk about this digitalization, we talk about two technologies which are very current, and these are blockchain and artificial intelligence. In the last directives from the European Union linked to the energy market, when we talk about digitalization, these technologies don't appear much. For example, in the directive of 2024, it is mentioned twice, but in the case of the directive on the improve of the electric market of the Union, it only appears once. But this is a main topic for improving this digitalization. Therefore, it was interesting for us to explore these technologies from the perspective of engineering and programming. These have been studied, but on the legal side, they are not very studied because digitalization is not very considered. We will talk about these two technologies, as I said before, but there's a word that we see here, which is very important, and this is interoperability. We will highlight potential and challenges in the integration of these two technologies, but interoperability, we have seen it with the batteries and with other technologies. And this is another added layer. We find technologies in which this interoperability is extremely necessary to reach all the goals that have been thought. We will start talking about the artificial intelligence, then the blockchain, and then we will talk about the legal challenges. Good morning, and I wanted to thank you all. Thank you to the two directors and the organizers of the Congress. As for the legal aspects of the artificial intelligence, this is one of the main topics that everyone is talking about right now, and the intensive treatment of data. What I would like to highlight here on artificial intelligence mainly are the different the different models of strategies that can be used to extract knowledge and intelligence from data. Here we are talking about all the data that are generated by a single grid, but moreover, also the energy communities, consumption data, excessive energy that the energy community has generated and that goes to the grid. This can be analyzed, and I always like to explain this technology in the following way. Imagine an Excel with the marks of the grades of our students and the evolution that our students have done with the different grades. And then we do 30%, we do this weighing, right? And at the end, we get the final grade. But at a glance, I can draw conclusions from there, from the marks, from the grades that I see, and I can establish patterns of evolution in terms of their individual evolution and global evolution. What allows me to do this artificial intelligence? This Excel, instead of having 60 registers, which means 60 students, imagine 7 columns. If we multiply that by 100, 1,000, a million registers, a human person can extract knowledge from there? No, that's why we need these models. Probably the people in the back will see this very small, but actually I will send you the presentation afterwards. This has been explained by ENISA, and these models talk about this integration of these technologies in the energy markets. ENISA has always also published guidelines in relation to, for example, electric vehicles, grids, etc. This explains it very well. And each of these models allows us to do different tasks. For example, with this regression, the regression models allow us to make a prediction of the amount of energy that an energy community will produce in excess. With a classification model, for example, I can analyze what are the appliances, for example, that a household has that has a major consumption and see their evolution. The clustering models allow me to associate groups with similar behavior patterns. Reduction of the dimensionality allows me to reduce the amount of variables, because this is a problem in the case of artificial intelligence. The higher number of variables, the more complicated it will be to extract quality data. So we need to work on that. There are different models, and the colors refer to how we interpret them, because AI present challenges. To what extent a human person can understand the results that this model extracts. This is one of the challenges. And with regards to the life cycle, AI life cycle, we need to take this into account as well. We need to feed the data, and this data needs to be quality data. In an energy community, we have data with different formats, different characteristics, and so on and so forth. And this is another technological challenge that we face. And not every model does the same, and not every model is useful to work with data. The analysis that we have done on the type of models that are applied in the case of energy communities are very different, but almost all of them, except for some exceptions, are theoretical. They are not based on analysis, except for 2 or 3 specific cases that we have found on the different literature. Most of them haven't worked in real cases. So what is their viability? For now, we are only analyzing it theoretically, and we have been crazy looking for cases in which both technologies have been applied and with real contacts. Moreover, these models need to be tested, validated, and adjusted. And the problem is that in the theoretical approaches, you can't do this validation.
Sí, perdón, que en cuanto a los temas en los que hemos identificado, en los que se utiliza dentro del amplio espectro de comunidades energéticas, en los que se utilizan, se han visto implementaciones.
We have seen these implementations from the theoretical point of view or some use cases. When the AI is implemented, it's implemented in smart buildings and in the management of the energy communities. How renewables are integrated, the production of energy in PV and energy storage, the prediction on how that energy will be stored, and so forth. In the chapter, you can see the different subtopics and the AI models that are generally applied. I will try to explain this very fast. We are doing well about time. Yes, I want only to talk about the technical aspects of blockchain. And the previous speaker was very useful for my topic because I wanted to talk about aggregators as well. As we can see here, the blockchain is an enabling technology, but this generates different legal problems. And as we say, many problems arise here. Most of you will know what blockchain is, but it is fundamented in these networks. It distributes the information, so the different nodes. There's a central. The different nodes are validators, and this information is distributed in the different nodes. And this means that there's an added safety. So for now, here's where we are. There's this layer. And there's another interesting topic, which is that configuration of the blockchain network. Blockchain is based in this decentralization. And different consensus algorithms can be established. There have been several evolutions. As Estrella has said, consensus algorithms for energy communities. And this is what provides governance, great governance. I know that you know that, but inside the blockchain, there are different configurations. There will be the base with these consensus algorithms, but this governance will be determined in a few or many individuals. Then we have the private grids, the public grids. So depending on the technology, this technology can be decentralized, but the decisions might be taken by many. Basically, that's it. In terms of safety in transactions, the way in which the information is stored, this information is encrypted. Every block of information is linked to the previous one, and the information included is encrypted. So this adds different safety layers, which provides resilience. So this makes that this technology has different applications because it allows us this decentralization of the energy production, and this allows us to have different configurations like the programming of smart contract, automatize procedures, avoid intermediaries, etc. But we all know that, and I will try to go a bit beyond that. What is interesting here is that, first of all, blockchain, everything can be traced.
Sí, pues 5 minutos, pues no sé yo. En fin, pues se puede trazar todo, tiene esa trazabilidad.
There's this traceability, but the information off-chain, which is not generated inside, needs to be verified previously. And this is done using information obtained linked to these systems of battery production, extraction of AI data. So we combine different technologies. But what interests me most is this last part that we can see here. With the blockchain, we don't only get this traceability, but also we can do the tokenization of different elements. In the case of the energy production, we are talking about tokenizing energy. And I want to thank Professor Galera for her explanation, because it was very clear. But the grid is not adapted yet to this reality, and in other regulated markets like the financial market, we are already using the blockchain for different things, for different matters. So it will be interesting to start studying the implementation of the blockchain in this market, because if not, we will have markets at different speeds. In 1 minute, I will try to explain that. This is a challenge, honestly. We are talking about decentralizing, and with this regulation, the previous speaker, when he explained the problem, the legal problem, there is this aggregation, and the blockchain allows us to deal with this. The famous decentralized communities, because we are talking about this decentralization that then can have an application, and this is already done in the financial sector. This configuration allows us to create these entities in which there's a governance of the sovereignty of the members of that community. This has to do with the possibility of generating this sovereignty in the decision-making, and this is interesting to facilitate the process, because otherwise we would need more intermediaries. When this will be studied, we need to take two things into consideration. First of all, we create the blockchain using an existing grid, and for that, when we analyze it, we need to take into account the consensus algorithm to see the possibilities of certain abuses of certain nodes. So, depending on how the decisions will be made, we need to take different things into consideration. And if we use an existing network with a structure and their consensus algorithm, we can create this operations layer. And in that case, and this is what happens also in the financial market, there's a problem with the governance tokens.
Muy rápido y en
Very
titulares. Claro, siguiendo con las cuestiones de gobernanza que planteaba Vanessa, es decir, podemos integrar.
As we continue with governance, as Vanessa was saying, we see how to generate a governance system in an energy community that implements AI. If it's a theoretical approach as yet, can we integrate data analysis, data that we've taken from an energy community into a data space? For example, into the Green Deal data space, one that has been specifically defined there, the governance system would have to determine this. There is an initial level for legal compliance. There must be an integration, a translation of all of the relevant legislation applicable to that data set in order to be reused and used by third parties. Second, we must consider the digital ecosystem, the energy community itself, with its structure, with its organization, and the platform. We're at the platform level. It can be a cloud model where all of the data are stored there and analyzed there in real time, and so forth. Then there is another level, the data space itself. The data space enables you to process those data, to exchange those data with third parties in a safe way, and generate added value services. The final layer is that of governance, data governance here. The implementation of the AI regulations are important with specific obligations on data governance and data quality. This enables transparency and control for access and the use that is made of those data. This is obviously a theoretical approach. There has not been found any cases of energy communities that are integrated into the usage cases of the Green Deal. They may exist, but we haven't found them. And if we can take 2 more minutes, please. You want to, I want to come back in the future. I don't want to be excommunicated from the university. But there's a bit of redundancy up here. Anyway, in 1 minute and a half, or however long I can. Okay, 2 minutes. It's because I have to say this. We're talking about energy markets, and there's a double phase issue, seeing how this can be adapted to this kind of market. What elements can facilitate that? And if these kinds of projects are proposed legally, the elements to take into account. We have the possibilities there. There are more, but they have been summarized. The smart contracts and so forth. It's a matter of auditing how those contracts are programmed to determine the legal design from the outset. Blockchain is for 2 things, to regulate commodities and for investment. Regulation. Energy regulation allows us to develop projects in their initial phases when tokenization is done. For larger companies that allow tenders for certain projects, but there can also be certain forms of external financing with energy tokenization. And I could go into greater detail, but I don't want anyone to kill me or for the people who follow me to kill me because we're behind time. But here, there are some considerations of the financial market. As you know, there is a market for crypto assets and tokenized assets. When it comes to the integration of energy markets, we're already there in some projects. In Madrid, this is another element to market and finance certain kinds of projects. And I would speak more about this, but I can't. Just 1 more minute to talk about resilience. We have a great book, and we could take this opportunity to advertise it. It's part of the content. Thank you very much for that. And thank you.
Bien, a continuación tiene la palabra el profesor Alejandro Leiva. Gracias.
We'll now give the floor to Professor Alejandro Leiva. Thank you.
Bueno, muchas gracias.
Thank you. And first, thanks to the directors of this event, Andreas and Susana, for inviting me to participate here and to join the project in the day, this project, which has now been manifested in the publication of this book. The topic for today's presentation has to do with grids. Directly and indirectly, other colleagues have already mentioned this. I will speak in detail about the regulation on third-party access, specifically limiting that to the energy communities and all the projects that make up a local energy community. As for the definition, this appears in the Royal Decree 23/2020. It is taken up as a legal entity with open voluntary participation, autonomous control made up of legal persons, SMEs, and local authorities, and it is not for profit. A local energy community has a number of projects that are carried out. Those projects have to interact with the grid by necessity. There can be no, as we've heard earlier, they begin to regulate self-consumption. There can be no isolated self-consumption. Self-consumption is always connected to a grid, and the energy community is always connected to a grid. The project has to be connected to the grid. It has to do with the Spanish regulation and determine how that relationship is going to take place, because there are projects that have a generator role, others projects have a demand role, others have storage, is a bit more conflicted. To enter as 100% generator, 100% demand, there's some criticism of that, and to see how that is being developed by the securities control entity in Spain. This is all very dense, but I will try to speak to the regulations and the current situation. These are the projects that I was mentioning. Fundamentally, we have self-consumption installations as the main element of an energy community that is the most attractive option, as it is with and without dumping onto the grid. And these advancements are very well known. Auxiliary services, storage, we've heard about this, charging electric vehicles, regulations that have to be developed, the internal grids, closed grids that are in a community. From there on, the focus that I want to take with this presentation is, on one hand, to see the technical situation from a technical situation with and without connection, all these projects, the technical standpoint, and the development of them. We have some regulations of the CNMC, circulars on access of generators and by demand, which is what I want to focus most on, and a lot of pending details, specifications, details. The CNMC, the Spanish Securities Commission, are still working on this. And then I will briefly mention, although I think it is even, well, it may be interesting, the economic side of things, the economic financial side of things. One thing is for it to be nonprofit, another is for it to lose money. There must be some return, and the return is going to depend on the adaptation, the fees that are paid by the community, because if consumption, if all the fees are placed on the fixed part, there's a discouragement, not just on self-consumption, of also energy efficiency. Susana knows very well. And it's all a very interesting set of factors, because the new regulations are being still developed. The debate is underway. All the circulars on fees and other forms of compensation are still being discussed for the new regulatory period that is beginning in 2026 up to 2031. So from a technical standpoint, as for regulations, beginning with the electrical sector law 1183/2020, that determines that the CNMC regulates competition, compensatory figures. Article 33 determines how the Securities Commission must do it, and then by circular, the conditions for access and connection, and all that other content that you see on the slide. Then, going down to the second level, the Royal Decree mentioned by my colleague, 1183/2020. This Royal Decree is the most general on access and connection. It establishes the obligations for permits, general criteria, procedural criteria. All of this is going, we go further, as we go further down to more general to more specific, there must be a definition of general criteria, procedural criteria, considerations on expirations. It's also very relevant. Expirations for generation that have caused all of these times for speculations, knots, and so forth, and capacity tenders. Then the CNMC, with circulars, has begun to divide among the terms for connections and access for generators and access and connection conditions for demand. And there we have a circular by the CNMC 1/2024 and 1/2021. And all of these procedures are outlined in detail in very transparent terms, and they're interesting for energy communities. Energy communities need this information to develop their projects, and there are evaluation criteria for capacity and viability, and also flexible access. This is very relevant. That comes in the circular on demand. Then the circulars are still being developed, and there must be further development in other rulings from the CNMC that are under discussion, such as the issue of flexible access. I'm just going to focus on the demand circular for two reasons. It's more recent, so it's more opportune to do so. And also the demand side seems a bit more worrisome than the generation side. Some of the things in generation, we went from 2019, we had 1,000 to many more megawatts in the grid. In demand, we went from 264 terawatts to 244 terawatts. Therefore, there must be some improvements in access and connection conditions for demand. And in relation to the topic of this Congress, everything that has to do with demand is very interesting to look at. Here there is a breakdown, self-consumption in terms of generation. All those regulations are applicable in storage. Once it receives it from the grid, it may enter as demand or generation. For storage, it's also very complex because either it enters at 100% as demand. This requires flexibility from a technical standpoint. Hybrid installations also count as generation, and self-consumption without dumping, consider demand, storage, consider demand, auxiliary services as demand, infrastructure for EV charging as demand. Most of these things are developed in energy communities. This circular will be applicable to them. I'm not saying the generation is not important, but generation, with the advances we've had through conflicts of access that have been resolved by the CNMC, expirations, this almost like a science fiction movie with speculation, not playing about with the market. The regulations for demand are still under development. We have the regulations from the CNMC with all of the players taking part, but these regulations, it's something of a negotiation between companies and other players in the sector, the public sector as well, and everyone is saying their own two bits. Here we see a lot of procedures in the circular. I don't have time to go into detail on them, but just want to highlight the most relevant and of greatest interest for local energy communities. In the end, this is the circular 1/2024 on demand. And what the circular does is break it all down, details the procedures from the beginning to the end. It all begins with the presentation of an application where there is a request, and this is the first important step if you want fixed or flexible capacity. This is the new terminology. Susana mentioned European interest in the idea, not expanding the ideas of planning with all of these millions of kilometers of infrastructure that you to pay for, the fees in each country, but to maximize the use of what is already there. And therefore, there's an introduction of this concept of flexible access, which, as we also know, is good for storage, what is required by, which requires flexible conditions. Also, this was also said by the Director of Energy of the CNMC. It is still being configured. This specification is still being configured, but it's to tell the energy community that they're not going to enter 100% of the hours into the grid, only part of it. The capacity to charge an electrical vehicle, you don't enter during the peaks. And this, therefore, with the experience of the Netherlands, as we heard yesterday, a matter of adapting to a similar system as is used there. That's point number one. Then there are some other matters, the reception of applications for correction. Correction means that there is quite a bit of conflict here because information is requested from the promoters, from the developers, and the developer may not have this information. There's a bit of opaque data there, and we need to improve this for the sake of transparency, for the community to have enough information. Energy communities and all projects need information. First of all, as accurate as possible. It can't be perfect. And this is stated by the CNMC on electrification, permits, and the capacity of the substation. That is the issue that is pending development, and it's the most interesting of all. Here we're developing projects, but there must be space in the grid, in the substation. And in terms of procedures, there's analysis of the application. There's an evaluation of the existence of capacity for access. The capacity of access is analyzed based on specifications in detail that are now being developed, and there are determined whether or not there is flexible capacity. The possibility for suspension, this is also possible, and as it occurs in generation, if you want to go to a node, substation, etc., there can be capacity for access. There is a tender for demand and temporary regulation. There has been improvement in this. There was a time in which the interlocutors of the node, they were doing their own thing, their own interest. It was the first interlocutor arrived, and then an upholding arrived. A lot of things have been learned from practical experience, and the demand regulations must take into account the experience of generation, and that regulations try to overcome all of these things. And continuing with the results, acceptances, the prior proposal of the applicant and the acceptance of the proposal. These are items that are procedural in nature. To continue now, there must be an issue of licenses, permits. Here, we're going to mention the possible expiration of permits. As we've learned from the past, we've established 5-year terms of expiration to keep someone from coming in, taking their point in the node, keeping the permits, and since they never expire, they don't ask you for those prior administration and authorizations for construction operation. Obviously, that's a case of speculation, and we avoid speculation this way. So, flexibility, we've already mentioned this. This is pending development and detail from the CNMC. In terms of transparency, it's important to point out that we've already heard from the other colleague about the Royal Decree of 2020, heard about the processing steps, and there must be an implementation of the capacity level of the node. This is pending resolution from the CNMC. It is fundamental. The community must know where they enter and the capacity that is there. And they must also know in what conditions. It's not all firm capacity. There's also flexible capacity. They must know the real guarantees of this. There's a bit more to develop. But to finish up this technical part, because I think the financial part is more interesting. It is, if you are more interested in the technical things, I can provide this later. The important thing about the technical side, and it's all pending development from the CNMC, the new concept of flexible capacity, you're not going to enter for 100% of the hours, and the publicity of the capacity for access within the substation, and for the economic regimen, it's important to point out that we need distribution to have POs like the Eléctrica, the grid operator has, because that is where you get the detail on the need for investment. For energy communities, this information is necessary to introduce flexibility into the grid and also into storage, that there be a flexible approach to storage. The economic system could be described as follows. The next regulatory period is 2026-2031. In 2019, when the CMC took over by instruction of the electric supply law, the first regulatory period was established. Now it's ending with circulars for fees, electricity generation, distributors, and so forth. And now a change is coming. This is being discussed in public consultation in the new regulatory period. What is necessary here? Improvement, in my opinion. In terms of compensation, you have to keep both sides happy. You have to pay the energy community something that allows them to recoup their investment, but the consumer also needs, even though it's a low-risk market, they also need to be benefited. This circular must provide more encouragement to deregulation. The distributor in the regulated compensation for their distribution, all of these economic details, which are very hard to understand, even for me as an attorney. We need to progress toward a scenario in which both sides can be satisfied and the needs of the project can also be met for energy communities. Therefore, retribution, compensation is something that we all pay for in terms of fees in our electrical bills, whether you're a community or self-consumer or whatever. There's another matter that is very delicate. The fees circular is also being configured, and it's this issue of saying what percentage of fees are paid by the fixed amount in electricity bills. If it's 55% approximately of the compensation for grids, this morning I saw an electricity bill is 23% of my electricity bill. Obviously, this depends. In my case, it's 2.0, but it's more or less that percentage. And I will be concluding soon. So this is what it stands for. If that 20% of the regulated cost is not just that, it's more expensive. There are many more controversies here. If the fee, this percentage volume is 20%, how can it be so much on the fixed part? If it's so much on the fixed part where an energy community cannot be, or self-consumption cannot be, where is the incentive to be a self-consumer? We all know that in the day, even if you don't consume, the bills are very high because of all the fixed costs. So where is the encouragement? Where's the incentive? Or for energy efficiency or energy savings, you have to study a bit more and see the configuration of the fees to see if we can lower or put more fees on the variable side. Therefore, if you don't self-consume, you're paying more for the grids. The cost is there and it must be paid. And even though this doesn't have to do with the grid, we also pay other charges. These charges are another 10% of the bill. And that's a whole other debate because charges also fall on the fixed part. We all know that they are the legacy of policies from the past. And a whole other can of worms is to be open there. It doesn't have to do with grids, but I think I and others agree that it must be taken from the general budget of the state of the country. It's a very interesting debate because the economic side must contain incentives to make the return on the investment sufficient. Thank you very much.
Muy bien, muchas gracias a todos. Bueno, creo que ha quedado
Thank
de
you to one
manifiesto
and all. I think it's
que
been made very
tenemos que
clear
empezar otra sesión solo para que estos cuatro
after
ponentes
this
puedan
session
terminar
with
con
these
tranquilidad
4 speakers for them
y
to
verter
conclude
todo el conocimiento que
with
tienen.
peace of
Así que,
mind
Andrew, Susana,
and
no es
share
suficiente,
their
necesitamos
knowledge.
otra más. Y
Andrea,
también
Susana, we
porque
need
no hemos
more
dejado lo mejor que podemos, ¿vale? Bien,
time with them,
antes
and I've done my
de
best
pasar
to chair the
a la
session.
pausa
Before
café, por
we
indicar
move
por
on
nuestro
to our
coordinador, si hay
coffee break,
alguna
if
pregunta que
anyone has
quieran
any
realizar.
questions, we can take those at this time.
los ponentes.
Si me permitís, en el uso de mi potestad de coordinador del evento, me
If
gustaría,
I could, I would like
que
to
Estrella y Vanessa nos
have
ofrecieran
Estrella and Vanessa offer
rápidamente
us very quickly
una conclusión de aquello que les ha faltado por
a conclusion, as they didn't have time to give their conclusions.
Perdón, que la tenéis, bueno, tenéis
Well,
la
you
presentación.
have the presentation there.
Una de las cosas que hemos hecho en analizar toda
One
la
thing that we
literatura,
did when we analyzed all the literature, scientific literature
bueno,
that exists
basado en casos reales, que como
based
digo,
on real
de los
cases
17 casos
of
que
the
hemos podido
17
identificar de
cases that we
aplicación
identified
específica
for
de
specific
inteligencia artificial,
application
por
of
ejemplo,
AI, for example,
blockchain o no,
with
u otro tipo de
blockchain, without
tecnologías,
blockchain, other technologies,
solamente 7 casos
only 7
abordaban límites
cases
jurídicos, lo cual
approached legal
refleja la
challenges.
necesidad de que
So
desde el
that
punto de
shows
vista
the need
jurídico
for,
abordemos la integración de
from
estas
a legal
tecnologías.
standpoint,
Y entre los
we
temas
really take a
identificados,
look at those
por ejemplo,
technologies. And those that we
aparece
did
todo
identify,
el
it
tema de
appeared
protección de
that
datos, que tiene que ver, por
data
ejemplo, con el tema
protection was
de
important.
contadores
That has to
inteligentes
do with smart
y el
meters
análisis
and
de los
the
perfiles de los
analysis
prosumers.
of
Es un tema
the
tremendo.
profiles of prosumers.
¿Por qué? Pues
It's a very
porque,
big
aunque no
issue.
son datos sensibles desde
Although
el
they're
punto
not
de vista de la
sensitive
normativa de
data
protección de datos,
in
sí
terms
que
of the
plantean
data protection regulations,
la
they do bring
monitorización de
up
los consumos
a monitoring of consumptions
de una vivienda, de una
from
unidad
a
familiar,
home, from
y
a
te da un
family
perfil
unit,
muy intrusivo
and gives you a very
de las
intrusive
personas que
profile
viven ahí.
into the
Entonces,
people who live
se
there.
plantean, por ejemplo,
So
cuestiones como
there
cómo
are
proteger esos
ideas
datos, ¿no?
such as how
Se
to
utilizan
protect
distintos,
those
en
data.
algunos
In
trabajos se analizan
some
algunas estrategias, por
projects,
ejemplo, el
strategies are
aprendizaje
being
federal,
analyzed.
que tiene mucho que ver con la distribución de toda
A
la información
federated
en
model
distintos
that has to
nodos,
do
y
with
entonces cada
distribution
nodo
through different
aplica modelos
nodes.
distintos de
Each node
inteligencia
applies a
artificial
different
que,
model of
digamos,
artificial intelligence,
los patrones
and
identificados
the identified patterns
por así decirlo, los parámetros de
or
cada modelo
parameters
se
of each
integran en
model
un modelo
are
único,
integrated into a
en
single
otro
model
nodo diferente,
in a
que
different
permite el
node.
tratamiento de los datos personales
This
con una mayor
enables the
precisión.
processing of personal data with
Por
greater
ejemplo, la
protection.
encriptación. Comentaba
Encryption, for
Vanessa que
example, as Vanessa
con
said,
la computación cuántica, la
with quantum
encriptación
computing,
actual se nos iría al
encryption
garete. Bueno, pues por ejemplo,
will
se
go down the
plantea
drain.
aplicación de cifrado homomórfico, es decir,
Therefore,
hacer tratamiento de
non-morphic
datos encriptados que
deciphering is being
permite
proposed,
una mayor
processing encrypted
privacidad
data
de toda la
that enables
información.
greater
Y hay
privacy of all
muchísimas
information.
técnicas que se
And
plantean,
there are many
pero no son
techniques,
técnicas
but they're not
que estén,
techniques
es decir, que se
that
hayan probado, que se hayan
have been
identificado sobre
proven
datasets reales.
on real
Casi
data.
todas estas técnicas, sobre todo,
Almost all of
vienen
these
de otros ámbitos,
techniques
por ejemplo, de la
come
salud.
from other
Claro,
areas,
y aquí
health, for
digo,
example.
oiga,
That's what
este
I
tipo de
am putting
técnicas se
forth
podrían
here.
plantear aquí.
These kinds
Y
of
por
techniques
último,
can
por
be used
ejemplo,
here.
cuestiones
And
como la
last,
ciberseguridad.
things like cybersecurity.
La inteligencia artificial blockchain tiene sus
Artificial
franjas
intelligence
específicas de
blockchain has
ciberseguridad.
specific
Aquí tenemos que tener en
cybersecurity
cuenta la
challenges.
implementación de
We
la
have to
NIS
consider the
2, que
implementation
es
of
una
ANIS
directiva,
2.
una
It's a
directiva específica
directive
sobre la seguridad en redes y
on
sistemas de información.
cybersecurity,
Y
networks,
por
and
cerrar,
information
si en
systems.
una
And to
comunidad
conclude,
energética, tal y como
if
está
in
planteado
an
en el
energy
marco
community,
regulatorio
as
español,
we're
puede
saying in the Spanish
participar de manera
regulatory
local,
realm,
las entidades locales
can
están
be proposed
sujetas al
by
esquema
local
nacional de
governments.
seguridad.
They are subject to the
En fin,
national
y por supuesto la implementación
security
del reglamento de emergencia
system.
provincial. ¿Por qué? Por si la comunidad
And this
energética está
also
integrada, es
includes
decir, la vamos a integrar, imaginemos una smart city
AI,
en un
if you're going to
distrito,
integrate a smart
en un
city
distrito energético,
into
etcétera.
an energy district,
Claro,
etc.
todo eso va a formar parte de una
All of these things
infraestructura
are going to form
crítica.
part of a
Lo hemos
critical
visto ahora
infrastructure.
con el apagón.
And we just saw this with the
Las
blackout.
infraestructuras críticas tienen
Critical
también su
infrastructures
normativa
also
específica
have a
y
specific
plantean requisitos de
regulations,
seguridad importantes.
set of
Y estos
regulations,
son los
and have
temas, algunos de los
cybersecurity
temas que se han ido
implications. These are some
identificando.
of the
Los
topics that have
tenéis
been
todos
identified.
ahí
They are
recogidos
all taken up
en
in
el capítulo,
the
pero como
chapter
digo, es
on
muy a
this topic.
nivel
But
teórico y
it's all very
solamente
theoretical, and only one
o dos
or
ejemplos
two
muy
examples,
específicos en donde
very
se han
specific
trabajado
examples,
datasets reales.
where
Se le han llamado
it has been
cuestiones
worked
jurídicas.
on
En tres,
in
perdón.
real cases,
En tres. No, no, es un poco para
only
cerrarlo.
on 3.
Todo lo que hemos visto, estamos ahora mismo, por así decirlo, en pañales.
What we have seen, we are
para la regulación
very
de las
soon
smart cities.
in
Tenemos
terms
que
of
estar atentos al
regulations
momento en el que estamos.
for smart
Cuando se
cities,
habla
and
de
we need to be
digitalización, que hablamos
conscious of
de,
that.
por ejemplo, el tema de
When we
determinar
talked about
precios,
digitalization and determining the
también se
prices,
utiliza algoritmos. Entonces,
it also the algorithm also intervenes. So enabling technologies, AI and blockchain, need to be integrated in this regulatory development present and future, in the development of smart cities and so forth. Why? Because we will need resilience, we will be connected. We are seeing that in the finance sector. Matters of safety and privacy and market integration. These two matters will be connected, and this is still under evolution, but the idea is that we need to continue in this automatization because this helps us reduce costs of transaction. We will see if the electrical companies are interested in that or not, but this is another thing. And also the investments. When we have to analyze that, we can't forget that these new technologies are being applied in other sectors, and we can't make a new regulation here when we are still making the transition. So we still need to analyze this more. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. We still need 5 more minutes to finish preparing the coffee break area so we can take more questions from the public or more remarks. First of all, sorry, because I couldn't hear Susana because I was with an energy community. No, with another one. Well, actually, they told me that all the speakers were very interesting, but I couldn't hear the first one. And as you know, we are preparing a sandbox. But just Alejandro, for me, from my point of view, as I see it, one of the greatest debates is the regulatory framework in distribution. Because how can I communicate with them? In the sandbox, we are seeing the scenario of sharing dynamic coefficients. If I introduce blockchain, they won't understand all that, and there's no way. So as I see it, and here there's a problem with the retributory framework in terms of CapEx. And actually, what we need to do is do the transition to OpEx. So a new ORTD on self-consumption, collective self-consumption. What is the reality is that you do the self-consumption, and out of 100 consumers, there are 30 mistakes in the metering. And the first month, the people are excited, but after 3 months with these mistakes in metering, if there's a company that offers them a better deal, what are they going to do? Obviously, what you would also do, they don't have motivation and they stop. So I think that to make it viable and feasible, we need to change this ORTD in terms of collective self-consumption. And according to other criteria or a different relationship with the distribution, without that, this scenario won't be possible. This is my opinion. Because when sharing, I mean, how many people are doing collective self-consumption with time distribution? Have you tried to legally do that with this time distribution? Time blockchain. It's not possible. It's not possible because there are mistakes in metering. These are constant. The interpreter apologizes, but she can't hear the... Perfect, thank you. We have a legal framework, but the reality is that there's a transition from the Royal Decree 344 that was interpreted like a static time distribution, and this is better than the pure static. But the reality is that main distributors companies with the distribution over the year and over the whole day, they don't apply it. And if I have to legalize a collective self-consumption, I always recommend them not to legalize it with the time distribution. What do I mean? We still need to make this change, this switch from the CapEx to OpEx. And with new ORTDs, and they need to charge according to the service they offer. There was something interesting from Aldea. And the small ones legalized it reasonably, and the big ones, it was a catastrophe. One thing is that they are not for profit, and another thing is that they are not profitable. And this is in the scenario in which we are right now. But Alejandro, so the remuneration system, how do you see it? Are you participating in the public consultation? We have made new allegations, we have made new proposals, and we don't only have a new ORTD on self-consumption, but also other aspects, because the problem right now is the managing of that network. What can I say here? Actually, at the end, the investment in the remuneration process makes everything better.
Sino bueno, pues que es necesario también buenos incentivos a la digitalización.
It's necessary to make investments to the distribution. But I have to study all the things that you have said. I want to study them on paper, so I have more questions actually. And ultimately, there are more things to take into consideration. What you said about CapEx and OpEx, I totally agree. I wrote about it some time ago, and I think this is a fundamental topic. And how is this then represented on the bills? The notice is very good, but what about the tolls notice? The problems in metering. How much represents the fixed part? And when the flexible comes into force, what will happen? Will the consumer pay more than the usage than they do? This is an internal debate, but I will study more about this topic that you mentioned. Thank you.
Última pregunta y
last question, and we will then do the coffee break. First of all, thank you to all the speakers because you were all excellent. Your presentations, well, at a very high level. And this is only a remark on a topic that hasn't been mentioned, and it worries me. Inclusion of vulnerable subjects in energy communities. This is a major problem that we face in all directives. This is referred. It says that we should eliminate barriers and we should foster the access to people, to vulnerable communities, but we still face problems. Vulnerable communities can't access energy communities. As we said yesterday, energy communities have problems when reaching and knowing also who are those vulnerable people. Vulnerable people face problems when contacting the commercializers when they want to do a self-consumption. So maybe we should work more and work together to change this, because as I see it, we are still doing very few, and it's something that we should deal urgently and actually, and not only theoretically. Because what we do right now is that this is true. We need them to access the energy communities, but we should do something. We should change the regulations, for example. Currently, they are mentioning the possibility that energy communities only receive financing when inside that energy communities are vulnerable people and when they do something to reduce the energy poverty, but only if the state includes this in the plan. So if Spain is now elaborating their plan, maybe we should do something so that they take this into account when writing down their plan. It was only a remark. I just wanted to mention this here and make this proposal. And thank you again for your presentations. Thank you.
Ya por ahora vamos a rellenar el tiempo. Ya lo
de hecho ya podemos salir.
We could close this session.
Voy a salir a apedrear ya directamente de aquí.
Gracias.
Nada, simplemente
No, I just wanted to say that I agree with you.
Laura lo conoce
and Laura knows it.
Yo también después un poco la línea del tema del género, ¿no? Que parece que esto es
I
para
also want to point out gender, because it seems that this is only for white men with money energy communities. So I would like to open this to all collectives, involve women, because we haven't talked about all circumstances, and of course open it to vulnerable communities because they are forgotten. How are you going to tell a vulnerable collective that they have mistakes in the matterings? How do they do these matterings? They don't know it. They have many problems in their lives, so they can't take care of this mattering.
Estoy motivada y por supuesto soy hombre porque estoy más tranquilo, entonces claro me dedico a hacerlo, pero el resto del mundo no puede.
Only men with time, they can dedicate themselves to these energy communities, but the rest of the world, they don't even know what an energy community is. What can we do? Thousands of things. We can start from the administrative standpoint. We have to mention this to them.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you.
Ha sido una mesa maravillosa.
This has been a very interesting panel.
Interrumpimos por 20 minutos.
So we will now make a coffee break of 20 minutes. Thank you.
Creo que ya está.
Sí, sí.
Buenos días.
Good morning. So we will continue with today's session. And in this case, it's my turn to moderate this panel. I hope to be as good as my predecessor. But you have done a very good job, so this is a great challenge. I will be very brief. I first want to thank the organizers, my colleagues, my friends, for having invited me to be part of this panel. And maybe this is because of two different things. Because I'm a professor of the Universitat de Barcelona, and I am also the director of an organization that unites different governments and different associations. And the foundation that I chair deals with the topic, which is the topic for this session, energy communities at the local level. During the coffee break, I said that this topic was very unknown to me, and not long ago there was something that they asked our foundation to organize a conference on energy communities. We did that. We organized that session. Now I'm a professional in energy communities. I'm at the service of what they asked me to do. And this was a big surprise to me. It was a twofold surprise. The first one was because of the assistance, hundreds of people who came from the region, but also from other parts of Spain. And my second surprise was how interesting the topic was from the legal point of view, but not only. In fact, after that first initiative, the foundation has organized other conferences on that same topic, and we have published a collaborative book on that topic. It is available online, and this adds up the book that will be presented after this panel to enrich the literature on the topic. Local energy communities, from our perspective, are a fundamental tool to promote democratization of the different electrical supplies, and it allows citizens and local governments to involve in the managing of the renewable energies. We have seen that there are major challenges like the improvement of the regulatory frameworks, but also the need to promote the efforts from the institutions, and here the local institutions, not only the municipalities, but also the intermediaries play a major role. But it's not my turn to talk today, fortunately, but rather the people who accompany me here. These four friends of mine. I am going to be very strict with time. And the idea is that you speak for 15 minutes, maximum 20. And after these 20 minutes, I will ask you to stop. The first people that will have the floor will be Manuela Mora from Universidad de Huelva on smart cities and energy communities. The floor is yours. Thank you very much. Good morning. First of all, and just 5 seconds, thank you for Professor Cocciolo and Professor Galera. It is a pleasure for me to come to Universitat Rovira y Virgili. And during the coffee break, I said that I would like to thank the coordinators. And honestly, I don't know what else I can say because the previous panel was very interesting. But actually, in my case, I will try to talk about smart cities and energy communities with the idea that in cities, the local are in the center of transformations needed to make the transition to a new model of consumption. Therefore, what I want to do today is give a few ideas on the background of the local context in the climate change and the energy transition. Mention only a few ideas on the energy communities, and finally, some remarks. And the first idea I wanted to mention is how to connect the city and the strategies to fight against climate change from the local level. We are inside a transformation process which is unstoppable. We need to change the way in which we consume and in which we produce. And we are inside a major also energy transformation process. The economists say that we need to believe, we need to acknowledge the positive and negative differences with the environment. And we need to take this into consideration. We need to reduce the gas emissions. We need to increase the production of renewable energies. All these are factors, and here the local level is a part of the solution to these problems. And we are talking about a problem with multiple layers. In my title, I mentioned smart cities and energy communities, and this allows us to say that we need to acknowledge the position of the local level when fighting against the climate change. And in that sense, digitalization and decarbonization are two elements in which the local level can play an important role. And something else, the context is of collaboration, cooperation. So an approach bottom up from the infrastatal, it needs to have its space. We need to acknowledge the capacity that they have to contribute against the climate change. Moreover, this is not something only from the state, only from the big states, but on the contrary, we need to give space to those infrastatal entities. And I would like to highlight here a plural construction in terms of the subjects that can face this fight against the climate change. Climate change is a global problem, but it's something that we need to deal with inside the territory. The characteristics of the territory have a lot to do. Therefore, this means that it is legitimized that the local entities have something to do. These entities need to have the possibility to contribute to this green transition because territories as economic and environmental levels are the ones who receive the impact of climate change, and this needs to be present, whatever our approach is. I think that Professor Galera said it this morning in the EU. Since 2014, 70% of population will live in cities soon. The United Nations has said it so. So the urban places will need to live this transformation. Cities our microcosmos, and therefore we will need to face all these general problems that we are seeing related to the climate change. And this is the way in which cities can guarantee optimal levels of quality of life. And we need to explore new ways of organizing the urban areas. And hence the idea of smart cities. Smart cities as an alternative to face problems, complex problems like climate change. The thing is, what do we understand by smart city? And here we have everything is still pending.
Lo que sí les planteo, y porque es un poco en la línea en la que hemos trabajado en mi grupo de investigación, es que el concepto de ciudad inteligente deberá
But
ser
actually, the concept of smart city, it is wide and it should integrate some minimum levels of development and sustainability to face these challenges and give this importance to the local level. We talk about sustainable smart cities as the construction that we need to reach. What is a smart city? On the one side, it needs to be able to guarantee this green transition, this energy transition, but also there are technologies here and AI, and they can help us in this development. What I would like to highlight is that smart cities need to take these technologies into account and they need to use them to make this transition when building and development sustainability. These technologies allow us to manage this flow of data that will help us make decisions. And in that sense, it facilitates, it helps us understand the smart city as an urban environment that can fight against this climate change. Again, I insist on this wide idea of the smart cities because there are other concepts that reinforce this idea. We can talk about territorial intelligence, and this brings up the capacities that local territories need to assume to solve their own problems using their resources.
En este sentido, bueno, pues sobre todo desde la economía, la inteligencia territorial se asocia a la idea de ética.
This is associated with the idea of ethics of sustainability. It's a parameter which is fundamental, and it is this sustainability, this idea that we need to reach this sustainability in terms of energy to guarantee the transition. I believe that we need to acknowledge this opportunity, this capacity of the smart cities to deal with these challenges related with the increase of renewable energies, and technologies here play an important role. They help us create local policies tailor-made for every territory. And this is also what appears in the law. For example, Article 6 of the state law, decarbonization through digitalization. Also, many references in the law of the autonomous communities. And another quote that insists on promoting a decentralized model, just and equal, in which the smart grids will be key. In this context, what are the opportunities for the energy communities?
Pues prácticamente es que le podemos dar todo el protagonismo que queramos. Nos
They
están
are
proporcionando
very important
un
because
escenario
they
muy interesante, pero en
give
primer
us
lugar para
a very
remover esos
interesting
mercados
scenario
centralizados en manos de
to
pequeñas y grandes
change the
empresas en cuanto a
centralized
la producción y
market
distribución de energías
in terms of
y por otra
production and
parte
distribution
nos
of
están
energy.
ofreciendo un
And
escenario
on
de
the other
apertura,
hand, they
de
offer us the possibility
descentralización,
of
de
opening,
democratización en cuanto a
decentralize,
producción, distribución e
democratize
incluso
the
de las
production, the
energías, ¿no?
distribution of energies.
Desde esta perspectiva, yo
So
creo
from
que las
this
comunidades
perspective,
energéticas, y
I
lo han
think
dicho antes,
that
quienes lo han
energy
precedido,
communities
pues evidentemente ayudan a
help
consolidar otro tipo de principios, otro
consolidate
tipo de
other
concepciones respecto
principles,
de la energía.
other
El profesor Rosenfeld habla
conceptions
de una
related
de reconocer, por ejemplo, el principio
to
de
the energy.
autogestión energética,
We should
porque ello da
acknowledge the
cabida a la
principle of
entrada de comunidades energéticas,
self-regulation
aggregadores, autoconsumidores,
because
y de
this
esta manera
opens the door
democratiza
to
esa idea
independent
de producción
aggregators
de
and
la
so
energía.
forth.
Y añade, cosa que también se ha mencionado esta mañana,
And it
la
is
sobre
also
la
added
flexibilidad. La necesidad de
flexibility,
articular un
the
ordenamiento
need
jurídico
to
un poco
have a
diferente,
legal
en el que
framework
haya capacidad
which is
de
different
articular soluciones
with
no
the
tan cerradas
capacity of
expresamente, ¿no?
having
Y a
new
priori.
solutions and more
No
flexible.
tenemos, y lo han dicho antes, un marco
We
jurídico
don't have a
satisfactorio
legal
respecto de las
framework which
comunidades energéticas,
satisfies
pero a
us
mí sí me interesa
in
destacar
terms
que
of
desde la
energy
definición del
communities,
clima sí se están dando
but
algunos pasitos de configuración de
climate-wise,
estas comunidades energéticas.
some steps have
Desde
been
plan
made.
integrado de energía y clima, pero las leyes de clima autonómicas son especialmente explícitas al respecto y les pongo un par de ejemplos.
And I will
El
give you
artículo
some
19.1 de la
examples.
ley del
Articles
16/2017 de
Article
Cataluña habla de que el
19.1 from
30% de la
Catalonia
energía
says
eléctrica
that
renovable
30% of
será
electrical
distribuida
and
y
renewable
facilitada por la
energy will be
ciudadanía, las
distributed
pymes y las comunidades
by the
energéticas. La ley
citizens
vasca de
and
cambio
energy
climático insiste
communities.
en la
The
participación de la
legislation from
comunidad
the
y expresamente se
Basque
refiere a
country
que las
insists on the
comunidades energéticas
participation of
constituyen
the
una
community
fórmula, ¿no?, para
and
ello.
mentions the
Y me
energy
parece
communities for that.
especialmente
And I think
ilustrativa
it
de
is also
vincularse
very
con la Ley
illustrative.
5/2024 de medidas
Law
de 19 de diciembre de
5
medidas de fomento de
2024
las comunidades energéticas y autoconsumo industrial de Aragón. Por
to
primera
promote the
vez hay una
self-consumption of
definición,
Aragon. So for the
una
first time
conceptualización de esa
here
comunidad energética,
appears
insistiendo
these
en
energy
la
communities as
participación
well,
activa
and
y
it sees
voluntaria
in
de
its
quienes la integran y en
insists
que el
on the
objetivo no es
participation
financiero, ni mucho
on
menos.
its
No
members
es
of its
obtener
members,
beneficios financieros, sino
and the
obtener beneficios medioambientales y
objective is
sociales
to
en los
obtain
términos que antes había
environmental
dicho,
and social
para no tener
benefits, and
pérdidas,
not
¿no?
only economic
Todas estas
benefits.
normas insisten en el fomento de esas
All
soluciones
these
para la
norms
generación de
insists
energía
on the
procedente de fuentes
promotion
renovables y como una fórmula de
on these
capacitación
renewable
de la
energies,
ciudadanía, la gestión de la energía, de democratización, lo ha dicho antes el profesor Galán, y de implicación
democratize,
de las administraciones
and
locales.
involve
Y
the
aquí
local
es donde yo quisiera
administrations.
llamar la atención. Claro,
And here
las
I
ciudades,
would like
las
to
smart
say something
cities,
else.
como
Cities, smart
nivel local,
cities,
tienen una gran
like the
capacidad
local
de
level, they have a
transformación
great capacity
de actuar como motor de
to
transformación.
act
Bien porque
as
asuman
this
un papel de
transformation
promotor o incentivador, cambian su
either because
normativa
in their
y
because they
role
have to
as
actuación de
change
promoters,
cuestiones
their
de incentivo y
regulations,
de
they can
promoción, o
assume
bien porque se
incentives and
convierten en
they
promotion,
sujetos activos en primera persona
and
de estas
they
figuras
need to
de
be active
participación y democratización,
in
con todos los
participating in this
problemas que antes se han
democratization
dicho y en
with
los
the
que yo no
problems
he
that they have mentioned before
quedo relevada, ¿no?, de esa tarea en esta
that I
cosa
won't
de
mention
celeridad.
again.
Bueno, algunas cuestiones por ir terminando. Primero, la lucha contra el
just
cambio
to
climático
conclude, the fight
constituye, yo
against
creo, el
climate
punto de
change
partida de
is
un
the
proceso
starting point
irrenunciable de
for an
transformación
irrenounceable
ecológica
process of
en el que las
ecological
entidades locales
transformation
tienen
in
un
which
peso
local
y un papel
governments
central que
play
no
a
podemos
central role
obviar. Que
that
por
we
el
cannot
contrario
ignore.
está garantizado, o al menos es la pretensión de
Otherwise,
todo el ordenamiento del clima que está
they
surgiendo en estos últimos
all of
tiempos.
the climate
En este
and environmental
sentido,
regulations will be
debe
in vain.
reconocerse la centralidad en
Along
la
these lines,
utilización
we
de las
must recognize
renovables
the
y
central
especialmente
nature
la tarea
of
de avanzar en la
municipal
construcción de las ciudades
regulations and the need to
inteligentes,
advance
pero
in the
en esa
construction of smart cities.
conceptualización
But
integradora,
within that
amplia, en la que es
integrational,
inteligente no solo TIC, inteligente
wide-ranging
significa
concept
también
of cities, of
realización
smart
de la
cities, smart
sostenibilidad en términos
must also
económicos,
mean sustainable
sociales y sobre
in
todo
economic,
ambientales.
social, and environmental
Las
terms.
ciudades inteligentes dentro de los límites del
Smart
desarrollo
cities
sostenible y desde esa
within
perspectiva
the
holística
developments of
nos sitúan
with
a mi
the limits
juicio
of
en
sustainable
un
development
nivel, en una situación de
form
cambialización
a level
socio-jurídica y
and
de
socio
normales, como
juridic
antes señalaba el
judicial
profesor Galán.
innovation.
Y en este contexto
in our cities. Along these lines, energy communities can be a tool that are interesting at the very least, to transform our production and consumer models for energy, to decarbonize and to collectivize and democratize. All of these things must be followed. These communities, and now I am concluding, are a change in the perspective of local regulations, and they point us toward innovation, and they will pave the way for smart cities. But they also give us an opportunity to begin to build flexible rights with capacity for adaptation in a proactive way, in which there is a presence, and this is fundamental, a presence of the dynamics and the different socio-ecological dynamics of each municipal government and energy community. Thank you, Manuela. And yes, in fact, you have to be bad sometimes for people to pay attention to you. But seriously, the idea is to finish all these presentations, to have some time for discussion at the end. So thank you for staying on time. Now we will hear from Professor Joan Herrera from the Rovira y Virgili University. He has a long career and is now a member of the academic community, and he will talk about energetic communities in urban settings. Joan, you may take the floor. Thank you, Alfredo. And first of all, I'd like to thank Susana and Andrius for their invitation and allowing me to take part in this fantastic book and provide a bit of experience and a bit of reflection on the subject matter. And I will speak in a twofold role as an associate professor at the Rovira Virgili University, a truly associate professor, and someone who has set up energy communities in the town of El Prat de Llobregat, and I am now working to help Samsung to build energy communities, acquiring assets and establishing the administrative structure of energy communities and so forth. So I will try to take an academic but also a practical approach to the topic. What is an energy community? Is it an island or an actor? The communities are they all the people who come together motivated to do this, or a true energy actor? The administration wants them to be an actor, a player. They don't want it to be a group of enthusiasts, and that is what the directive says for a reason, because the energy communities, as defined as part of the energy citizenship, is a key factor to recover trust, the necessary trust in a sector in which there are a lot of unmanageable renewable energy. So you need to trust energy communities. Now, most energy communities are made up of enthusiasts, and I say this with utmost respect. I am one of these enthusiasts. I don't mean any disparaging remarks against them. And there are some players, true players, who are setting up energy communities. That is the reality. Most communities are in rural areas. If you count the urban communities with a calling to provide energy to the cities or large neighborhoods, you can count those with one hand. And that's because since 2018, many years have passed. It's now 2025. This is the reality today. What is the goal of today's presentation? It is a summarized presentation. I'm not going to give you all the articles. I'm going to give you some ideas. I think the main ideas are in the text and we can all read them. But I want to visualize the central nature of the urban nature. I want to analyze regulatory obstacles. I want to look at some real cases and propose some measures. What is the urban challenge? I think we conceive of this, as has been said, it's the urban setting is where the energy transition must play a leading role. That's where most consumption takes place. That is where most emissions are produced. And that is why I think that cities are the ideal setting for self-consumption. But above all, we must change the modality and electrify thermal consumption, because if you allow me, I don't know how this is going to be translated. That is the crux of the matter. The crux of the matter.
Todos estos actores, todos
All
estos
of
necesitan.
these players.
No lo han traducido, ¿no?
I translated it as crux of the matter.
Of the lamb.
The mother of the lamb in Spanish is the crux of the matter in English. Thank you.
Bueno, yo creo que para que todo esto sea realidad, que necesitamos la interacción del mundo local. Y el mundo local significa
why we need the local world with the leadership of the local administration. Energy communities arise in a European community where they played a leading role among the different municipalities, lands, territories. In the end, the authority of an energy community in a rural area relies on word of mouth, but in an urban setting, the active participation of the local government is what gives neutrality to the energy community and authority to citizens. That is the key element. This is the idea that I wanted to convey with citizens, SMEs, and local governments. Communities democratize energy, promote self-consumption, storage, and mobility. They are also vehicles for citizen participation. Local governments can be the promoters, the facilitators, the guarantors of trust. They're going to allow you access to roofs, simplify administrative procedures, and these are key to energy communities. The calling is that there not be 20 communities. There can be, but that they be true actors and achieve economies of scale. And for this to be possible, there should be many communities in urban settings, but led above all by the municipal administration. That should be the desire, the goal of what we must build. We have the regulatory framework as defined by the directives, but the truth is we need a facilitating regulatory framework. As many climate change laws as there are, you can try to talk to the Secretary of the Environmental Affairs in the local council to get them to participate. What is an ONE? A UFO, unidentified flying object. An OENI is an unidentified electric object. UEO, a UEO.
¿Y por qué es un objeto eléctrico no
Why
identificado?
is it an unidentified electrical object? These electrical communities, in a recent discussion that I had with members of the CNMC, they said that there were two non-regulated subjects, and they didn't know how to interact with them. One was energy communities, and the other was an independent bundler. If they are taken up in the electric sector law, but they are unregulated. In Article 2, referring to citizen community energy communities, there 2 years ago, there was a draft of the Royal Decree on energy communities that is now in a drawer somewhere. And when it comes to creating and operating an energy community, it's all about subsidies. That is not how you define legal security. That is not how you build a facilitating framework so that the municipal government can participate in the energy community. That's why I like to talk about a UEO, an unidentified electrical object, because you can theorize about the role of citizens in energy communities. But if that facilitation framework, that favorable legal framework that the communities refer to, it's very difficult without one to advance from the low right, the soft rights, the soft law that we have. It's hard to advance. What about the paradox of the Spanish framework? It is a facilitating framework of the directives. We have a sector law when it comes to energy transition, it's not just about electricity, it is also about energy, and that sector law on the electric sector recognizes the role of local governments. But it is true that from the budget law from 2013, what we have in Spain is a limiting framework for the competencies of local governments. Local councils. Laura Piche, professor, has written a great book about local governments and in this regard, and local governments, climate change. And the climate change law is a mess that did not attribute competencies to local governments. And now, when you discuss with the local council their participation in energy community, we have to appeal to the economic austerity laws. It's very dense and hard to understand, and it does not talk about energy communities. It talks about emissions, it talks about low emission zones in cities of a certain size, but the main factor, that of energy, does not define competencies that would facilitate the creation and participation in an energy community. Therefore, I think that the very first task beyond the royal decree and regulatory development is for the local world, political world, to do this, and they aren't doing it. That the local world, provincial governments, local councils, and so forth, engage a debate to reclaim competencies in energy. Because if not, the energy community will just be an island of enthusiasts and will never be a player. That is the case. For an energy community to be able to develop blockchain technology and have authority, we need the local council to be a key player. And there are other considerations on this that are in the chapter that I've written. It can be a consortium, it can be a different form, and I disagree. Why can't the local council be a majority stakeholder? It says that it can't be. The directive is inspired by the company's utilities, but the local council represents citizens. If they are in the community, why can't they be a majority stakeholder? It's because the law doesn't allow it.
Y aquí es donde voy a la principal tesis del artículo.
Is where I get to the main thesis of the article. We have a European mandate and a European obstacle, a European barrier, local barrier, excuse me. That means that local council participated energy communities must engage in a very complicated bureaucratic process, and you only achieve the approval with a great deal of effort. And if the secretary of the local council doesn't oppose it and block the bureaucratic procedure, that is the case. They have to help you. That is the reality of what happens in local councils. What are the participation data at local councils? Local councils promote, but in how many energy communities do they participate? These are data from the CODES Observatory based on Implementa 1 and 2. They cover 1 and 2, 3 and 4. I participated in the council that discussed the new data. The local council represents 0.22% of the partners in energy communities. In most local councils, they promote, but they don't end up participating as members. Why? Because membership requires an economic activity license, and that also means a number of requisites. Most natural persons or legal persons, SMEs, but very few local councils. How many energy communities are there in the rural area? Energy communities of 5 or 6. There are 10 energy communities in urban settings in all of Spain. That is the reality. That is the reality. Facing this, we must have a legal framework for it to be a true player. There are three cases in this chapter. First, Rico Guinarda is a very nice community in the Guinardó neighborhood, very dense, with very bad and few eligible roofs. And they couldn't carry out the community because the local council did not grant them usage rights to the roof. Why not? Because the local council, and I think this is arguable, that they were taking too long with the tender process. Now they're installing 40, 50 kilowatts, but 40, 50 kilowatts in Guinardó are peanuts. Vilawatt is a beautiful example because it was an energy community before they existed. Vilawatt is in the town of Virgili, created a consortium participated in by the local council with majority participation. Also in the metropolitan area authorities with residents and companies, open voluntary participation. Is this an energy community? I think it is. Why? Because they guarantee open voluntary participation. When it says that there can't be majority participation, it doesn't refer necessarily to local councils. But now Vilawatt has renounced their self-consumption and are now moving toward a fee-based model based on roofs. Vilawatt has a lot of industrial estates around it with large roofs for photovoltaic installation to supply for domestic use. It's different in the Eixample or Salamanca neighborhoods where these sorts of roofs don't exist. And the third case is Energia del Prat that I have been involved in. It took a long time to set up the community. And the problem that we now have is how to guarantee the energy community supply energy to the local council. Not the transfer of assets and roofs, but how the community can serve the local council and how it can provide services. There is a successful case of shared electrical mobility, 14 vehicles. It's very good and a lot of potential for self-consumption, but they cannot be an energy community due to the competition laws. And those are just three examples. I think that we have to speak of energy communities in the urban settings when it comes to renewable energies or citizen communities. I think that urban energy communities must always work toward citizen communities, and in large cities like Barcelona, Madrid, and how they must work where citizen communities in cities can provide services to renewable communities in neighborhoods or districts. A common diagnosis, I think the main problem is the lack of protagonism and the lack of a legal framework that would facilitate the participation of the local government. That is the main handicap, the main thing that conditions the non-realization of urban communities, the non-reality, because there are not energy communities in cities in Spain. And I'm moving very quickly now. Proposals to change the law on the local system legal bases to declare energy communities as entities of public interest, something that we have worked on in my law firm. And when it is published, you will learn more about it. And to facilitate the transfer of municipal spaces and facilitate a legal framework for the return that energy communities can serve local councils, because local councils are the main energy consumers in most cities. And to conclude with a reflection, what do communities do? An energy community faces a challenge, self-consumption in the domestic setting. Self-consumption with a lot of renewables and cheaper prices at the midday, faces shorter periods added to the delays in access and connection, meter reading, errors, and so forth. These must exist as long as industrial, domestic, and logistic uses can coexist. Not so much domestic level, where 0.3 kilowatts is more than enough in apartments in the metropolitan area like Prat, where I have managed these things. Second, the importance of marketing. Without marketers doing their job well, you can't talk about vulnerable users or last resort tariffs. You can't tell them that self-consumption is going to work well. Therefore, there must be alignment and discipline among marketers or commercializers for this to be successful. Shared electric mobility has a great deal of potential. It is this factor of electrification that is so significant right now. And it could mark a change of habits in urban settings. If we live in cities, we don't need a car. We need to use a car from time to time, and a car with different characteristics. The third element is that energy communities as subjects to articulate monetized savings strategies. Here there must be a great proposal in regulatory development linked to a reform of the Mackay system to monetize savings for more years to promote efficiency. Added to the smart grids, how many cities have them? How many cities have the data on consumption island per island, block by block? Is it reasonable that if we set up a utility marketing entity, we have the data, but the local government does not? Therefore, there must be an integration of the local community, local councils into energy transition. And I think the major challenge for the coming years in the urban setting is storage and distributed storage. It's not behind or in front of the meter. It's going to depend on the price of electricity, but not attribute the curve of demand and distribution to 8 p.m. because there's very little consumption of the domestic variety. It's facing the 8 p.m. curve. That's the main challenge. Therefore, there's a great strategy, distributed storage. Here's an example, something that happened to me in an energy community. There was 30 kilowatts working at 0.3 kilowatts per neighbor. Nothing. But in that building, you could install a 100 kilowatt battery, charge cheap energy, electricity in the middle of the day, and provide electricity. Is that allowed by the regulations? Yes. But by the European law? No. When you look at August 2023 and May 2025, it was solved in 1.5 years. That's Article 10 piece of European Directive on Electricity. Can we share energy when this energy is renewable? Or we can share it when it's renewable or from batteries. So what did we try to do at the sandbox? That's it. Working in the domestic setting, urban settings, industrial settings, and even in towns. We can have a 1 megawatt battery at the entrance to the town, charge electricity, but the system needs to be flexible for storage and manageability, more than for generation. Therefore, this means introducing distributed storage. And there's very little that has to be changed because the law allows it. Mandate 10 of the directive as well. And we're looking at the royal decree for self-consumption. Makes this possible. Article 3B. This must be primary. We can change that and say that it can be from storage. And also with access and connection details. It is one of the keys for urban communities for distributed collective storage to be added to
de
energy
almacenamiento
communities for a backup
que además los números permiten que salgan.
in the form of
Tenía más
storage,
cosas,
and the
pero me he
numbers
pasado
tell
ya,
us
por
that
lo
it is
cual no he
possible.
sido
I had more to
disciplinado,
say,
perdonadme.
but I have run out of time and I have not been very disciplined. I'm sorry.
Joan, has puesto en evidencia que no soy una persona mala, sino un coladero.
Well, I'm obviously not a
Control del tiempo.
bad
Las
person.
intervenciones
I'm
muy
a
felicito.
terrible timekeeper.
Cuando has hecho
But
referencia si
when you
las
referred
comunidades son
to
actores o islas, me ha venido a la cabeza
communities being
tantas
players
películas
or
clásicas, ¿no?
islands, how many of those
De
old
los
movies
jóvenes que van a Hollywood
of young
con la
people
ilusión
who go to
de ser
Hollywood
actores y
with the
triunfar, ¿no?
excitement of being actors or
Y
actresses and
como
being
a ellos,
successful?
la voluntad
Like
es
them,
necesario, pero no
they
suficiente.
need a lot
Tienen
of
que
will,
cumplirse
but
otras
that's not
condiciones. Y en
enough.
nuestro caso,
There are other
lo
conditions that have to
fundamental
be
que
met.
debe es el
In
apoyo
our
institucional.
case, we need
Y en el apoyo
institutional
institucional, los
support.
gobiernos locales cumplen
Institutional
una función
support
esencial. Y
uh,
dentro de los gobiernos locales,
plays a key
y
role.
no entro en el debate porque no es mi función,
And within
una
those,
pieza que hay que tener muy presente
one
y que siempre se
key
visibiliza,
piece
como en tu intervención, son los habilitados nacionales,
are
secretarios y
the
interventores.
national
Yo
facilitators,
haría una reflexión
secretaries,
acerca de la empatía
and interveners.
respecto a estos trabajadores
Interveners. I
públicos
would speak
que
of
están siempre
a bit of
sometidos a una
empathy
fuerte tensión
in
y que
these
adolecen
civil servants.
de
They're
aquí
under a
donde
great deal of
tendríamos que
tension,
ir,
and they
en muchas
lack
ocasiones a una falta de formación en
training
este ámbito
in
y
this
de
area
sensibilización
and
también en este
sensitization
ámbito,
in
¿no?
this
Es
area.
decir, yo creo
They
que no se
lack
trata de
awareness.
enfrentarse con,
It's not a matter of
sino
confronting them,
ayudarles a
but helping them
ver
to see
la verdad,
the
ver la
truth,
verdad energética, ¿no?
the energy truth.
Volveremos sobre esto, Joan, después, si
So we'll
quieres,
come
y
back to
lo que me
this,
parece muy
Joanne, later
interesante,
on.
las
It's
formas como
very
pueden
interesting
participar los gobiernos
to see
locales,
the
etcétera,
different
¿no?
forms
Muy,
of
muy interesante.
participation by local councils, local governments, and so forth.
Me
Okay,
callo, me controlo yo también.
so I must also keep myself under
Ahora
control. Now
tendrá el uso de la
we will
palabra
hear
el compañero, el amigo Lorenzo,
from Lorenzo
Mellado, de la Universidad de Almería,
Mellado from the
que
University of
si hemos hablado de
Almería.
comunidades
If
energéticas
we've
urbanas,
spoken of
se
urban
enfoca
energy
únicamente
communities,
ahora
he will
sobre
focus
las
now
comunidades energéticas
on
en el ámbito rural, las
rural
comunidades
energy
energéticas
communities.
rurales.
Rural
Lorenzo,
energy
cuando quieras.
communities. Lorenzo, take it away.
Muchas gracias. Buenos días.
Thank you very much. Good morning,
Me
everyone.
voy a ajustar, falta un minuto para las menos cuarto para no comprometerte, para que me llamen la
It's
atención.
almost
Pero necesito agradecer, lógicamente, y lo hago de verdad, de
45.
corazón, la amable invitación para
So I
participar en
would
el
just
colectivo
like to
y en esta
thank you
jornada y dar la
for
enhorabuena no solo
inviting
por
me to participate
organizarlo,
in
ya es
these
complicado organizar
sessions.
3 o 4 cosas a la
It's
vez y hacer
complicated to
una
organize
responsabilidad
3
mucho
or
más
4
complicada
things all
todavía.
together and 5 even
Solo
more. So
a Susana Galera,
thank you,
compañera
Professor
Laura,
Cucciolo and
Alba, así
Professor
que muchas gracias a
Galera.
todos y enhorabuena.
Thank you, everyone, and congratulations for
Estoy
your
encantado
work.
de, lógicamente, estar aquí. Entre otras
It is a
cosas, porque
pleasure
cuando
to be
estaba ya
here.
abajo se me veía ya la incipiente calvicie, más que calvicie, y desde aquí arriba ya no se ve tanto. Pero yo creo que es por pensar mucho y no tanto por la edad, ¿eh? Bien, es
After
complicado
these
después de la
first
intervención de
words,
Joan,
it is
¿no?
complicated after
Yo no soy
Joan's
especialista, aunque sí sé un
presentation
poco versa sobre las comunidades energéticas
to
rurales, pero me da
intervene.
pie a la primera pregunta que quería plantear y es
But
todos estos
this
interrogantes,
introduces the
dudas,
first question. All
cuestiones,
these questions on
desde la propia configuración de qué es una
the
comunidad energética, qué
configuration
existe o no
of an
existe
energy
como tal,
community, if it
trasladarla a
exists
tuteo,
per
trasladarla a un
se,
pequeño, porque
we
ya
need
había dudas en
to
el ámbito
translate
local,
it
más o menos amplio,
to the
trasladarlo de un
rural
pequeño municipio rural, a una
setting,
cooperativa
to
agropecuaria,
a
a una
small
comunidad real
municipality, for
que quiere
example,
constituirse, pero entonces
who
deja de
wants
ser
to
cooperativa,
constitute
es a la vez
themselves.
cooperativa
Are
y
they
comunidad energética.
cooperatives or not? Are they
Cuando actúa
cooperative
como
and energy
cooperativa
community
energética,
at
se
the
ve que
same
tiene un
time?
régimen jurídico diferente a cuando actúa como
Do they
cooperativa.
have a
Y existen
different legal
muchísimas dudas, ya lo
framework that
sabéis.
applies depending
Entre
on
estas,
their
derivadas lógicamente,
entity
entre otras cuestiones,
and
por
their
la falta de
form?
regulación. Pero es que yo
There are many
creo que
questions,
ese proyecto de Real
and this
Decreto
is due to the
simplemente no
lack
salió
of
adelante. Que estaba ya
laws.
más, me parece, no lo sé, porque es decir, una comunidad energética solo
An
lo es a
energy
efectos de
community
ayudas, es que no
is
podemos
only
estar
an
así,
energy
porque es lo
community
que
because
hay.
of the
Es
subsidies
lo
that
que
they
hay.
receive.
Pero estamos así, ¿no? Pero también
This is
voy a hablar
the
ahora de
situation in
las
which we
relaciones
are
entre
right
comunidad
now, and I am
energética
going to
en
talk
cuanto a
about
la
the
evaluación
relationship
y transición
about
justa.
this
Es que
energy
transición justa no existe.
community and the just
Está muy bien,
transition.
la transición justa sí está en la Ley de Cambio Climático y Transición Energética. Sorprendentemente, las comunidades energéticas no están en la nacional.
Surprisingly,
La
energy
transición justa
communities
está,
are not
pero
in
no
the
está,
national
hay unas
legislation,
convocatorias de ayuda y hay municipios que
and there are
hay
different
la
subsidies,
filosofía, la tendencia, sí, todos tenemos claro
and
lo que
there's
significa, lo que se persigue.
and
Pero
everyone
hace
has
falta
very clear
algo
what
más,
it is, but we
tiene
need something
confianza,
more,
tiene
something to
seguridad,
inspire trust, to
sobre todo desde el
inspire
punto de vista, apuntaba Joan, de la
security
participación de los entes locales, porque cuando él hablaba no intervenía,
for
pero yo
the
estaba pensando
local
en la
entities to
contratación,
participate.
cómo contrata un ayuntamiento una comunidad energética en la que no participa, pero promueve, ¿cómo lo puede contratar? Y la
How can we
contratación es otro
promote
punto.
this participation?
Estructuro la intervención que voy a hacer
So the structure of my presentation will be the following one. The first one will be more of a context. Then we will define the concept and the functions because there's no regulation in that sense, and even less in the case of the rural energy communities.
Un poco de caracterización general, una aproximación al concepto y características.
Some general characteristics. Also, the characteristics that are the same ones are in the same ones as in the case of the urban areas, and then some legal concepts of the legal entity that an energy community could adopt. And I think that what is key to promote these low energy communities in the local area, we need to focus on the return of the investment. It is complicated to know what they can obtain or not, what they can do from the point of view from the remuneration, but the return to the territory, it's not very defined. Therefore, I will try to bring up something new. Maybe we just have to use the figure of the energy communities to look for new objectives, because the community legislation doesn't demand for a full legal person. It only demands for a center, someone who can act with this legal person. So we know the context, the energy communities in the rural areas, this transition towards this decentralized and distributed model. This transition from the centralized model and the external dependence aspires to this alternative model, and this transition to this different model, Professor Galera said it this morning, it's not the same, these two subsystems, one for the big production and the other one for the small production. I would like to link it to the traditional economies. What would be the role of the energy communities in the rural area? And then also talk about the subsidies to these affected territories and how to go towards new models with a new philosophy. That's why we need to link the sustainability with the idea of the just transition and smart communities or smart territories. Even if these legal concepts are very wide, I think that we can all agree that this revitalization of territories, affected areas, by this just transition links very well with the instrumentalization of the energy communities.
¿Cuál es la operatividad real de la participación? ¿No? Porque queda muy bien lo de la democratización
energética. What is the real function of participation, the operativity of this participation? A cooperative can install solar panels on their roofs and take advantage of this cooperative energy, but this needs to be something else, these energy communities. It needs to go beyond that functionality. It needs to be like a change of paradigm, and it needs to help this just transition. And we were talking about smart territories, intelligence. There's a word that I don't like, empowerment. Empowerment of people, members of a cooperative, and members of the territory. And this is the key.
La democratización del modelo de la generación de
Democratization
no es solo, como
of
digo,
the
en la
energy model
participación activa de los consumidores en la
doesn't have
producción,
to do
consumo y
only
en su
with
caso
the
comercialización de
participation of
energía.
members in the
Normalmente, luego lo diré,
consumption and
pero hablando del
distribution.
ámbito rural, normalmente serán
Talking
como
about the
energías
rural area,
renovables, CER,
this
aunque
would
no hay
be
una
mainly
categorización
renewable energy communities.
específica de uno y otro. Pero yo creo que en este
But I
nuevo
think
modelo en el
that
que
in
las
this
parejas ya
new
se
model,
incorporarán nuevos actores,
in
nuevos modelos
which
de
new
negocio,
players
como es de la
appear,
comunidad
new
energética,
business
en el
models,
ámbito rural, a lo que
in the
debe
rural area,
apuntarse sería la orientación de
we
esta
need to go
funcionalidad de la comunidad
towards
energética en rural
using
hacia
this
la
functionality
consecución de principios que existan en las leyes, pero que siguen siendo principios muy
for
vagos y muy
achieving the
estáticos.
principles, but these
Cohesión
principles are
territorial,
still very vague.
resiliencia, se ha dicho esta mañana, lucha contra la vulnerabilidad.
Territory, cohesion,
Me parece Laura decía
and
esta
so
mañana, bueno, ¿qué
forth.
pasa con los consumidores
Laura said
vulnerables?
this morning,
Pero
what happens with
es
the
que en una
vulnerable
cooperativa
communities?
no
But
es que
in
sea
a
vulnerable, es que no saben de lo que
cooperative,
está hablando con
they
una
are not
cooperativa rural.
vulnerable. The
En un
problem is that
territorio
they don't know
rural
what they
de
are
cualquier
talking
municipio
about.
pequeño.
And now
Entonces,
I
ya no
talk
solo la
about
vulnerabilidad o la
every
pobreza
rural
energética, el propio
area.
conocimiento. Estamos
So the
buscando
knowledge,
empoderar
we
a las personas
have
para
to
participar
empower
en la
people so that
producción de
they
energía y
can
consumo,
participate
pero
in the
primero eso hay que dar
production and
conocimiento, conoce
consumption of
ética.
energy. But
Y estos
for
principios
that,
de
we need to
cohesión
explain
territorial,
them first.
resiliencia, están muy bien en
And these
la ley de cambio
principles
climático
look
aparecen,
very well
pero
on
realmente no están
legislation, but
desarrollados
actually
hasta tal punto de
they are
justificar
not
la
developed
promoción de
to
las
the
comunidades
extent
energéticas rurales
of
que hay. Entonces,
justifying
curiosamente,
what
la ley de
these
cambio climático y
communities
transición
need.
energética 2021, que no habla de las comunidades energéticas, sí habla de centrales de energía renovable.
Legislation
Y
talks
ese no es el
about
modelo distribuido energético
renewable
que buscan las
energy
comunidades energéticas. Lógicamente es
sites.
otro modelo. Es verdad que también se
But this is not
requiere,
the model that
no
we
prioriza
are
la
that
generación
we are
distribuida, el consumo
searching.
distribuido, pero
It
sí que dice
doesn't
expresamente la ley de cambio
prioritize
climático,
the
y esto se
distributed
recoge claramente en las
generation,
reglas, la necesaria contribución al
but it talks
desarrollo
about
económico de
the
las zonas de
contribution
implantación y el respeto de los valores ambientales. Y esta es la
and
clave,
the
no la
respect
contraposición
of
objetiva.
the
¿Qué
environment.
queremos? Producción renovable,
What do we want?
gran producción de
Renewable
renovables, grandes parques
production,
eólicos, grandes
big
instalaciones
wind
fotovoltaicas,
parks,
o queremos modelos compatibles,
PV
yo te diría que
installations, or do we
ir
want
compatibilizando, de generación distribuida,
models
localizada,
adapted to this
especificada
distribution
y orientada fundamentalmente
and
no tanto al beneficio de las zonas
targeted
como al beneficio de las
towards
localidades
the
impactadas.
benefit of
Esta mañana se
the
decía, hay que recuperar la confianza. Bueno, ya sabemos
area.
todos los
We
problemas que
need
está habiendo en la
to
aceptabilidad social por
recover
grandes
the
macro
trust.
parques eólicos y fotovoltaicos. Bueno, las comunidades energéticas se orientan
Energy
a eso, no
communities,
solo a
this is their
participar, sino a
goal.
recuperar la
They
confianza, a
want the
saber que
participation,
no
but
se trata
also
tanto
they
de
want to
beneficio,
recover the
sino por
trust.
lo menos que lo que se va a generar con la comunidad energética
What
rural
they are going
va a
to
revertir
generate,
en el propio territorio de implantación.
it
Y es
needs
la clave
to
fundamental para
be
su
at
aceptabilidad.
return on their
Pues ese
community.
principio de resiliencia,
This resilience principle
compatibilidad con la
and
ordenación
resistance,
territorial, es lo que
compatibility,
marca ese doble objetivo que en realidad,
this
digo
is
yo, la
what
Unión Europea
marks this
lo
twofold
plantea en
objective.
términos
The EU
los dos de interés general, pero
brings
son
it
de
up,
cierta forma contrapuestos, porque a la vez que persigue la neutralidad
but
climática, la
actually
descarbonización,
it is
hace
the
poco oía
opposite.
las palabras energías renovables como energía de la
Recently,
libertad,
I
que me
heard
gustó, eso
that
está muy bien, muy
renewable
bonito,
energies
pero también
are
hay
like
que
freedom
luchar y
energies, and I
defender
liked that
revitalización de
idea,
las
but
zonas
we also
rurales,
have to
transición
fight
justa y lucha contra
to
la despoblación. Son dos
revitalize the
objetivos
rural
casi de
area.
país que no pueden
These
confrontar y que hay
are
que
national
lograr un
objectives,
cierto equilibrio en su
and we need
promoción, de
to
tal forma
reach
que,
this
cumpliendo el
balance
objetivo
in
de
their
producción de renovables, a la
transformation.
vez
We need to accomplish
se haga
the objectives from
una
the
política
EU,
de
but
lucha
at the
contra la
same time, we need
despoblación,
to
pobreza
fight
energética, transición
against
justa, adecuada. Porque
the
mañana se
energy,
decía, bueno,
energy
¿a qué nivel de
poverty and make
digitalización se ha
this
dicho
just
ahora? Sí, sí que a
transition. What
nivel
is the level of
ciudadano, ¿cómo los
digitalization?
ciudadanos pueden convender la factura
How
de la luz?
can the
Bueno,
citizens
¿qué
understand
pasó? El
the
apagón
bills,
de hace 2 semanas,
the
eso en un pueblo
blackout
en montaña pasó todas las
that
semanas
we lived recently? This
y se va
happens
la luz.
every
Pues
week
lógicamente un
in
apagón no es un
the
apagón de país,
small cities in
pero
the
porque la
mountains,
deficiencia
in
del
the
sistema
small
energético
towns
en las
in
zonas
the
rurales,
mountains.
en las zonas despobladas o zonas, como
Because in
digo,
area with
menos desarrolladas, es una
few population or
cuestión,
less
yo creo
developed,
que una cuestión de todos
this
los
is a
días,
problem
porque hay
that
problemas de seguridad
happens
en el abastecimiento, hay problemas de
very
acceso al propio
every
servicio
week.
universal de la
There
energía
are
con regularidad
problems in the
y hay problemas
access,
de los
and
propios
there are
costes de la energía
problems with the
por los propios
cost of
sobrecostes que conlleva
energy,
el llevar la energía a esas zonas aisladas.
the cost of bringing the energy
Las
to
comunidades
that
energéticas locales
isolated area.
en su proyección al mundo rural, pues lógicamente deben buscar solucionar esos problemas, deben orientarse a solucionar problemas,
What do they need to
pero
do? They need
ir
to
un poco
solve these
más allá. Es
problems, but
decir, que no
actually they
solo
need to
está la
go a
cumbia
bit
del calentamiento de
further.
placa, se trata de ir hacia
They need to go towards a new context in which they improve the environment They need to take advantage of the investments that they make, and it needs to be compatible with their agriculture. So everything needs to go all together. The renewable energy communities together with the traditional activities that happen in that territory. This is very general. We have no regulation in that case, but I think that this is the goal that we need to have in mind.
Política social, política ambiental. Es decir,
this is to achieve these demographic policies, social and environmental. This should be like the tool to achieve the goals. And these are the three main goals that mark the sustainability of every rural area. What would be the benefits of rural energy communities? Basically, in the case of the renewable ones, more participation, more sovereignty, collaboration with the integral rural development. I will move forward because we all know the characteristics, but is this a new philosophy with the new framework that we have? Can we achieve this? Actually, will this be true that the energy that the town will generate will stay in that town? What will be the transformation that it will undergo afterwards? It is complicated in general, but it is more complicated in the rural settings. The characteristics, they are not specific to the ones in the rural area, but I wanted to say simply, we talked about the participation of the local administrations. We should have this wide participation, but the local administration doesn't have to be a member. There are other ways of participating, like, for example, promoting, supporting them on how this energy community should operate. And as for the characteristics, you already know them, but I just want to mention the last one. Taking advantage of the benefits obtained, savings, investment on the community, but the environmental benefits are not that clear. The function of these energy communities in the rural area are clear: fight against unbalanced social unbalance, creation of jobs, new business models, energy savings. So I think that these objectives are very clear to all of us. I will go very quickly onto that. The legal framework are the ones as in the case of the urban energy communities. And the goal, it is not exclusive, and it's to give benefits, environmental, economic, and social to its members and to the area. What is the legal form that this local energy community should adopt? The EU gives the opportunity of being a CEL, and inside these different organization options, there are possibilities and problems. For the social economy formula, as Joan said before, there are 300, but how many of them are there truly looking for this return to the territory? It is complicated, right? But it seems that in the rural area, the best would be this social economy formula, and most of them are cooperatives. The public legal entities have more problems because of the lack of flexibility and the administrative procedures to create one. Also in the rural setting, from the first moment, we can find problems. We can't forget either Trump would solve it in 2 weeks, as the Professor Galera said before, but actually I heard last week that China and United States is generating the future and Europe is regulating it. Actually, the European regulation are norms to promote and incentivize the Constitution, but it doesn't seem so. The legal obstacles and administrative obstacles for the participation of a local entity in an energy community are very complex, and logically, this brings up many questions. However, local entities and rural local entities can participate in different ways in energy communities, from the authorizations, celebrating conventions, collaboration projects, giving public spaces, integration, but the problem comes here in the integration. There are many more examples in which the local entity is not an associate, but instead it's like a promoter and the entity who solves problems. And I wanted to focus on this thing, because even if it's an article which is just a draft, in this project that will regulate, this I think I have just 1 minute left, it says when an energy community provides benefits. It says so. When it is defined, when the benefits, economic benefits are defined, therefore the social and environmental are monetized. Reduction of energy costs, development of the social aspects, investments that provide benefits, environmental benefits. How will these cooperatives reinvest their benefits to improving the environment? Distribution of competencies, capacities to act, it is complicated, or to the development of the local area in which the activity takes place. How do these two possibilities will be interpreted? This is the question. And to wrap up, these environmental benefits are key, but not only specific to this area. Instead, they need to be global. And I want to finish with this idea. Just 20 seconds. There are problems in cooperatives on what these are. Only an energy community is the legal regime that needs to be applied. I think that the solution should be to create a new legal person to achieve these objectives associated to itself. So it doesn't need to fit perfectly, but we need to take advantage of this distribution to achieve certain objectives. And this should be useful to obtain subsidies. We need a legal framework, flexible, simple, thinking about the small towns that incentivize and inspire trusts to implement them. I am sorry if I am a bit late. Thank you.
Gracias, Lorenzo. Te has pasado, pero
Thank
muy
you,
poco y
Lorenzo.
más que justificado
You're not that
por el
late,
interés de
and
lo
it's
que
very
decías, ¿no?
justified because
Se
what
dice
you were
que
explaining
España
was extremely
poblacionalmente es
interesting.
urbana,
Spain
pero territorialmente
is
es
mainly
rural.
urban,
O sea, la
but
mayor parte del
their
territorio de nuestro
territory
país
is rural.
efectivamente es
So the main
rural. De la importancia
territory of
de la
Spain
perspectiva
is
rural en
rural.
todos los
So
temas
therefore,
y también en este.
it
En el caso de
is
las administraciones
very
locales
important, the
en el
topic
ámbito
you were
rural, los
talking
pequeños
about.
ayuntamientos rurales,
The small
caracterizado
local
por
councils, which are
falta de capacidad de
characterized
gestión, una
by the lack
especial
of
falta de capacidad de gestión.
managing
Muchas gracias, Lorenzo. Y ahora
capacities.
ya
Thank you,
para
Lorenzo.
terminar, como
And
última
now,
intervención,
to
vamos a dar la
finish this
palabra a Josep
panel,
María
we will
Arauzo
hear
Carot,
on Josep María Arauzo
también de
Carot,
la Universitat
also from
anfitriona, de la Universitat
Universitat
Rovira
Rovira y
Virgili,
Virgili,
que va a intervenir sobre la
on the
aceptabilidad
acceptance
de
of
las comunidades
energy
energéticas
communities
en la
across
brecha
the
urbano-rural.
urban-rural
Josep
divide.
María, cuando quieras tienes la palabra.
So the floor is
Bien, buenos
yours.
días, gracias.
Good
Yo, antes
morning,
de
thank
empezar,
you.
simplemente
And
advertir de que es
before I
un
start, I
trabajo
would
muy
like to
diferente a
say
los
that this
que,
is
a los que
very
hemos
different
podido
to the
escuchar hasta el día
presentations
de
that we
hoy,
have
hasta
heard
ahora.
previously.
Es un enfoque económico, no jurídico.
This
De
is
hecho,
an
soy
economical
catedrático de economía,
approach,
no tengo ninguna vinculación en
so
términos de
I
formación
don't have
jurídica y, por
any
tanto, lo
link
que
with
intentamos
the
ver en este
legal
trabajo, que es un
aspects,
trabajo
and
in
what we
curso
have
todavía
tried to do,
con Jordi
this is
Jaria y
still
Miguel
under
Manjón,
development
en el marco del
with
proyecto
Jordi
de
Jaria and Miguel
Community
Manjón,
Energy Systems, es ver
and our
el
objective is
fenómeno
to
de la
see
aceptabilidad, porque al margen de que
the
entendamos todos que
phenomenon
las
of
comunidades
acceptance.
energéticas
We all
pueden ser un
understand
actor
that energy
importante en este
communities can be
proceso
an
de
important
transición
player
energética
in
y
this
ecológica,
energy
hace
and green
falta, dado
transition,
que requieren una
but
participación social muy
since
importante,
social
hace falta
participation
que
is
detrás de esta
required,
participación haya
behind this
una
participation,
aceptabilidad
we
también
need
relevante.
this
Y lo que intentaremos
acceptance,
ver
which is
es
also
ver
relevant.
cuáles son los factores que
Therefore, what
explican
are the
y que
factors that
determinan
explain
esta
and
aceptación
determine this
social
social
de
acceptance
las comunidades
of
energéticas?
the
Y
energy
voy a,
communities?
como que de hecho es una presentación que estaba un
This is
poco
a
pensada para
presentation that
fórums
was
más bien económicos, donde
prepared for
al
economic
preámbulo
for us.
intentamos explicar que es una comunidad energética, pero aquí
We
pues es
will try
bastante
to, so here it's
innecesario.
not
Voy a
necessary to explain
ir
what an
más
energy community
directamente
is, and I
lo que es
will
propiamente
go
el
directly
núcleo del trabajo, que no deja de ser
to the center of
una
the
aplicación empírica
study,
muy concreta.
which is an empirical
Y en concreto, si me permitís
approach.
que salte toda la
And
parte
if you
esta
allow me,
regulatoria, y vamos a lo que es el núcleo del trabajo. El problema es que no
the
sabemos
problem is
de
that we
forma
don't
cierta qué
know
factores
for sure
determinan una
what
mayor
are the
aceptabilidad.
factors that
No sabemos
determine
si son
this
factores
acceptance. We
colectivos,
don't
son
know
factores
whether these
individuales, son
factors are
factores
collective,
territoriales,
individuals,
y por tanto
territorial,
hay
and
literatura
therefore
en ese sentido, empírica,
there's
pero
literature,
literatura que
empirical
por desgracia
literature,
no ha
but
llegado a
unfortunately
resultados
there are
concluyentes, de
no
forma que hay
conclusive
un
results.
rango de variabilidad
So the
muy importante,
variability
y esto hace
range
que
is
haya
very
una
important,
cierta inseguridad
and
sobre realmente
hence
de qué es
there's
lo que estamos hablando.
uncertainty
¿Qué es lo que hemos hecho en
on
este
what
trabajo?
we are
Lo que hemos
talking
hecho
about.
es
What have we done?
una encuesta aplicada en
We
Cataluña,
have carried out a survey
en
in
Cataluña,
Catalonia,
donde en el momento en que empezamos
and when we
a plantear esta
started
encuesta, ahora hace un par de
working on
años,
this survey 2 years
había
ago,
alrededor de unos 70
there were
municipios con comunidades
around
energéticas,
70 municipalities
y
with
lo que
energy
consideramos es que
communities,
había
and we
un
considered
par de factores que eran
that
claves.
there
En primer
were
lugar,
2 factors which were
un
key.
factor
The
urbano-rural, y
first one,
consideramos que la
the
dimensión
factor
urbano-rural
urban-rural,
podía
and
tener
we
una
considered
importancia
that
relativa
this
a la hora de
divide
entender o
could
de
be
explicar una
important when
mayor o menor
understanding or
aceptación a
explaining
través de los
the
procesos de
acceptance
interacción social, que son muy diferentes
through
en
the
un entorno
social
rural
interaction
o en un entorno
processes, which are
urbano.
very
Y
different in the
después
rural
también
and the
entendíamos que
urban
había
settings.
otro fenómeno
And
que
we also
era lógico,
acknowledged that there
que
was
era
another phenomenon,
una mayor conexión previa
which was
con una
a
comunidad energética.
bigger
Podría, en cierta
connection
forma,
with an
condicionar
energy community.
no
This could
únicamente el conocimiento de esta, sino
condition
una
not only the
posterior
knowledge that
aceptación.
they
Por
have on
tanto,
that, and also
trabajamos
the ulterior
estructurando esta
acceptance.
encuesta con esta doble
We
dimensión urbana-rural y
prepared
con la
this
segunda
survey
dimensión de
with this
existencia o no,
divide
o
urban-rural,
inexistencia de una
taking
comunidad energética.
it into account.
Por tanto, lo que hicimos fue
What
seleccionar
we did
18
was to
municipios
select
en
18
Cataluña, 11
municipalities
con
in
comunidad
Catalonia,
energética, 7
11
sin
of them
comunidad
with an
energética,
energy community,
y
and
seleccionamos de
the
forma
rest of them
aleatoria. De hecho,
without one.
contratamos una
And
empresa a
we
este efecto.
selected randomly.
Seleccionamos
We
de forma
hired a
aleatoria un
company for
conjunto
this
de
random selection we selected adults to be surveyed. Here you can see the map of the distribution of municipalities depending on the type. This is not a randomly geographical distribution, because in Catalonia, this distribution is not random. They are concentrated in very specific parts of the country. What did we do? We had this sample of 1,840 respondents. The interviews were very brief, and we distinguished urban areas with community, urban areas without community, and rural areas with and without an energy community. And adjusting the weight to each of these communities in the whole territory. What we have done has been an econometric analysis, and basically what we tried to see was actually one of the questions was on the acceptance of the installation of an energy community in the municipality where the respondent lives. This went from 1 to 10, and we wanted to see, together with the rest of the characteristics that we had of the rest of the respondents, we wanted them to explain their opinion in terms of acceptance. Very general. We had some hypotheses on the factors that could play an influence. As I said before, the literature is very rare, but we identified 4 different vectors. 4 vectors that could have an influence. The first one, individual characteristics, gender, age, education, and labor status. Then a second vector, social and geographical context. And here we took into account the urban and rural divide, province, and so forth. Then a third vector that has to do with knowledge on regulation, Catalan regulation, Spanish regulation in terms of climate and environment, Paris Agreement, EU climate action, etc., etc. And then logically, knowledge on the energy communities. And then the fourth vector, environmental consciousness. Here we include their positions on fossil fuels or renewable energies. Moreover, what we also did was to include cross variables that combined 2 of these vectors with different combinations. And from there, for each of the vectors, we had different expectations on different ways that could affect the final acceptance of this energy community. And we understood that the education or the labor status should have a positive effect on the acceptance through different ways of knowledge, etc. What levels? In terms of the second vector, the local, the proximity, so the contact. The contact with an energy community should also increase the acceptance.
Dicho contacto, dicho proceso, tendría que ser más fácil en un ámbito rural porque el
This
canal
contact should be easier in a social setting, rural setting. There are relationships based on intangible, but also more effective factors, more so than urban settings that are more impersonal, where it's harder for everyone to get the knowledge that For example, in a single neighborhood, there's an energy community. It's easier to do in a rural area. And then another vector, that of knowledge. We thought that a greater knowledge of environmental regulations should have a positive impact on acceptance, and we expect the same to be true. A clearer, obvious effect that has been confirmed. Then in terms of environmental awareness, that there also be more environmental awareness. The thought is that just knowing about energy communities would lead to a greater acceptance of energy communities. I will skip through all the technical details. We've looked at 4 models with different econometric models, not always the same variables, but the results, which I'm going to show now, are quite robust because they are quite similar through the specifications. As we vary the methods and the variables, introducing crossed variables, the coefficients are usually maintained, and as is the representativeness. And what we get, although it may appear, despite what it may appear, is quite solid. I can't read this graph or table, but what we have essentially are 2 tables, one on the left. That's where it begins and it continues on the right, and it has 4 specifications in bold print. We see the different vectors that I've just been referring to. The first specification is the simplest of the 4 without any type of cross variable. And here, and the variables that are significant are in red. Referring to the first specification, which includes all of the variables referred to in the previous description, as expected, greater environmental awareness has a positive effect in evaluation terms. That is, people who express their preference for renewable energies, for the elimination of fossil fuels, this has a positive impact, and you can quantify it on how it impacts a positive impact on the acceptance of an energy community. But the variables of knowledge do not have any kind of effect. That is, the variables of knowledge do not have any sort of effect on acceptance or knowing what the mayor's agreement is or the Paris agreement is or the Spanish or Catalan regulations in a significant way. This is an econometric correlation. It's not about regressions or averages. It is the point as of which a variable has a significant impact on the others, and the other variable, of course, is acceptance. The knowledge, the one shown in red here in the first column, the lower part, knowledge on energy communities has a negative coefficient, surprisingly. So the more knowledge, the lower acceptance. And this is something that is very relevant, and that is the origin of the title of this paper. Knowledge might not be enough. It's not just about knowledge. Before we began, we thought that almost automatically, the more knowledge, the more acceptance. But that's not the case, or it's not what we have found. Therefore, let's look at this a bit closer, because there are many ways to measure impact. The social context is not something with a statistical significance. Being in a municipality with an energy community does not have a positive effect, nor does being in a rural community. The individual characteristics do not have any sort of significant impact either. And this dovetails with the ambiguous results that we find in literature. This is the first specification. What did we do in the second? We made it a bit more sophisticated, maintaining the same methodology. We added crossed variables, especially to bear in mind to what extent the urban-rural division could influence the effect on some of the variables that we have referred to. So what we have done is to calculate together all of the knowledge, the environmental regulatory knowledge. We calculate this together with urban or rural descriptions and analyze to what extent knowledge, the effect of knowledge on acceptance is also influenced by living in an urban or rural environment. And what we get, the positive figures for acceptance are maintained, but what we get is that there's no difference really. The effect of environmental regulation knowledge on acceptance is still not significant, regardless of the type of locale being studied. But the case is, knowing what an energy community is used to have a negative effect, but now we see that it has no effect on acceptance. But we did find something very interesting, and it was a characteristic that we will see maintained later on, and that is a positive effect. That is, those communities in which there is an energy community, there is a better acceptance. This fits with the idea of the more direct knowledge, according to our results, the more acceptance. But this takes place in a general way. But if we try to determine if it takes place in different types of municipalities, we see that the effect is negative in the urban setting. In the urban setting, in those territories, urban territories, where there is an energy community, the level of acceptance is lower. We're not looking at whether or not the individual was a member or of an energy community. So we have one differential factor, rural or urban. The mechanisms for the conveyance of knowledge are different. The type of implementation of an energy community or what an energy community is associated with in the urban or rural settings are also different. And we also looked at the rest of variables, and they have the same effect as in the previous specification. And in the third and fourth specification, what we have done are a couple extensions. And the first extension, what we have done is to cross personal characteristics with knowledge to see to what in what way the effect of individual characteristics, gender, age, education on acceptance, to see if they are altered by the level of knowledge that the individual has. And then what we attempted to explore was to what extent the effect of environmental awareness was impacted by membership or belonging to urban or rural setting. What we found was that, first off, there is no significant effect of the urban or rural setting when it comes to environmental awareness. In other words, environmental awareness is independent from the type of setting in which the individual lives. We continue to see that the knowledge of energy communities in these more complex specifications that we are monitoring for other factors, if this positive effect does exist. In other words, the more knowledge, the more acceptance. But when more factors are taken into account, and it's a very complex phenomenon, as I have said, and depending on the calculation method, we will see that acceptance is higher or lower if it is a municipality with an energy community. And this penalizing effect of urban communities with urban settings with energy communities. And what we also observe is that when we cross individual characteristics with knowledge, what we see is an effect of, if there are individuals of a higher educational level, there's a better acceptance of the energy community. When we cross those data and see what happens with individuals of higher education and what happens with an energy education, it's a negative effect. And this happens through different education levels. Well, then in that case, I will go to the conclusions. More than conclusions, there are implications of the economic policy. First, it's a very complex phenomenon. Acceptance is very complex. It's not just men or just women or young people or people who have high or low education. There are many crossing factors. Implementation is simpler in rural settings because there are processes of socialization, empathy that are much more direct than in urban settings. A proper strategy would be to prioritize, and I know that's not where the problem is or where most of the population is, but it would be apparently easier to increase the levels of acceptance of energy communities by making an additional effort in rural settings. And to conclude, since it is very complex, any campaign or public intervention that means to maximize acceptance must take into account the divergent factors of perception. And it's also important to have tailor-made campaigns, specific campaigns. A general campaign would not be any good because it would generate heterogeneous effects among all of the recipients of these campaigns. And this is something that is underway and still being developed. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, José María. Muy interesante tu intervención.
Thank you, José María, for that interesting presentation. Jurists, especially those of us who are very formalist, always underscore the importance of law to the extent that it's not that that law regulates the world, but that the world is law. But this is not the case. Transversality is inherent to reality, and it's also true for energy communities. From this economic, but also very sociological analysis that you provided, it's very interesting. And let me look at the organizers. We are out of time, very much out of time. Do we have a couple minutes for Q&A? 5 minutes, which will be 5 very strict minutes. If anyone would like to take the floor, they're in the back.
Bueno, buenos días o ya buenas tardes. Gracias a todos por las presentaciones.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the presentations. I would like to ask Mr. Arauzo Carot, not just because he was a professor of mine several years ago during my postdoc economics studies, but my thesis not only involves a judicial legal review of energy communities as a method of inclusion for vulnerable groups, but also I study the acceptance of this inclusion of vulnerable groups. So I would like to know if in your study you have asked on your questionnaires before conducting these surveys people from municipalities where there were energy communities. Were the respondents members of energy communities? We did not have that information. We did not include any questions like that because, due to other reasons, it was a very small sample. Any kind of additional information that we introduced complicated things a great deal when it came to meeting our goals. It was very difficult to meet the goals. This composition of municipalities that we've used, it was not the original one that we had thought. There was a constant interaction with the company doing the survey. And we went from our initial proposal of the questionnaire to the final version. We had to reduce it a great deal. We were going to ask about income to have a much clearer socioeconomic profile, but we had to get rid of those questions. So no, we did not have this information, but you are right. It is a very relevant dimension. And I'd also like to know, were there any final questions asking the public whether after doing the survey, if they would like to form part of an energy community? Not so much whether they would like it. There were two questions that asked to what extent you could tell us your expectations to participate in the future, but not so much directly, but hypothetically. And what we observed, or what was observed, was a bit of difference in the current and future evaluation, much more negative in the future than the current than in the future. Our analysis is that there was a perception that the current conditions would not guarantee the current participation, but if there were a change in these conditions, it would be much more viable to have a future participation. But we did not go into detail as to why their current or future evaluations were so different. Okay, thank you, Jose Maria. And now, please, if not, I will be in trouble. To be very brief, we are from the trenches of the local world. We're now drafting a project for 4 roofs and municipal facilities for self-consumption. We are preparing a study for an urban solar park or 9 megawatts per hour. We've heard a lot about AI in these sessions, but I think we need a lot of natural AI to legislate according to common sense and human needs, but we will always adapt to the situation and our abilities. What are the legal possibilities of convincing the authorities that the legal community with municipal participation is viable? And how could we support those efforts? Joan, I have said that we have to change the law, but there is a lot left to do. but they could make the road easier. There is a legal framework in which to advance. We're working with local councils, provincial councils, and so forth. The big problem right now is that energy is not part of the core value, the core priorities of municipal activity, municipal politics. Municipalities do culture, do lots of other things, but not energy. But energy is 4 to 5% of any municipality's budget. Interestingly enough, that's the main challenge. I would say there is room to work. At the same time, we must reclaim an easier road, and that's up to those who do regulatory implementation. I would like to ask Lorenzo a question. What about an agricultural cooperative that does not enable a section for all of the members of the inhabitants, so it's not an open and voluntary membership. It's only for the farmers that belong to the co-op. Is that an energy community? The authorities have said yes, but I think it's not. In the implementa document, an agricultural co-op said that they were an energy community to get some subsidies, but none of the local inhabitants could participate in that community. And they said, it is open because any farmer can participate, but we said, but not everyone is a farmer. So very quickly, I would say, no, it's not an energy community. But what about an irrigation community? It's not just 7 farmers. It's the same irrigation area that is restricted, even more restricted than a farming co-op. And there are examples of irrigation communities being energy communities, and also mountain owners, forest owners being an energy community. That also exists. Okay, well, we will return to this topic in the future. Let's reconvene in the future to discuss all these things, but we will conclude the session here because we have to hand it over to a very special moment, the presentation of the work that takes up all of these interventions and presentations, but in even greater detail. Thank you, one and all.
Bien, vamos a entrar en el momento final de
Okay, as we enter the final part of this Congress, which from yesterday till the present has given us ideas, concerns, and many unanswered questions, all of which obviously encourages us to request another project. but we will reduce this last moment devoted to presenting the book and close this conference as we are out of time, quite a bit out of time. And because I think we really couldn't improve the quality of the presentations we've heard yesterday and today. We are thrilled with all of our speakers and all of the audience members who have accompanied us these days. Yesterday, I said that when we conceived this project, conceiving a project called Regulation of Community Energy Systems based on storage and flexibility, we had a special hope, and also we got something right following the blackout. It's very revealing of our intuition, which was correct. And what I just mentioned, we declined from three different analytical angles: the acceptability, the issue, which is very controversial, but that brings legitimacy to a significant social change, as we have seen launching energy projects in a territory, just dropping them like that on a territory can generate resistance. Getting rid of fossil fuels can generate resistance, and of the many derivatives of the whole issue is governance, which is completely open because due to the vagueness of the legal framework and the great complexity and great inherent challenges in the necessary digitalization to deploy a new energy model and the deployment of energy communities. This is the final event of the project, I was going to say, but that's not really true. We have another thing at the end of the month, a webinar on digitalization led by Estrella and Vanessa. So we invite all of you to take part in that webinar online, and we will inform you about it in due time. So this project has been a challenge, a major challenge, a very complex topic. Now, we will present a few details on the book. Many national and international conferences have been attended for the preparation of this, and this work is important not just because it's ours and we're proud of it, or because of its size, over 820 pages, 25 chapters, and some 30 co-authors, 28 colleagues of ours who have accompanied us in this journey, a journey of reflection and analysis that has manifested itself in this book. And we want to very sincerely thank all of the co-authors who have made this book possible, made it possible for it to be a reality. And at this time, in these final moments of the Congress, Marcos Baquer Caballeria was to be with us, but he has been unable to do so. And he has brought great elegance and finesse to a prologue that is a beautiful work and that we're very grateful for.
As I said, we hope that this book is a reference in this matter, together with other important work that Professor Alfredo Galán has mentioned. And as I said, this is a book that has tried to talk about this complex topic from 3 different standpoints: energy communities as a tool to promote public participation, trust and confidence and acceptance, and ultimately legitimacy. Secondly, energy communities as platforms to empower citizens in communities and in local communities, and also as spaces for innovation. Innovation in terms of regulation, legal and technological. And moreover, in smart managing of consumer interchanges, storage, all these topics have brought up different proposals and have highlighted the problems and the challenges that are still open. Yesterday and today, these problems and these obstacles have arose. And well,
in December,
January, when we wrote the introduction to the book, I see here the sentence: the translation of these energy communities to the energy sector involves a necessary transition to more decentralized models to reduce the impact, non-desired impact of the generation and the consumption of energy. And we wrote that before the blackout. As for the book, it has 4 parts. The first one, we wanted it to be, we wanted to take into account the legal European framework and national and sub-statal framework, how this new model is defined, this decentralized model, and where do energy communities stand in this model. In the second part, as the previous panel has explained, we tried to place energy communities in different settings: urban, rural areas, industrial areas. We have seen that energy communities, by its definition, they are very flexible, and the indifference principle that Professor Mellado mentioned make that they can adapt to different realities and therefore to different legal tools. And this involves many problems. And yesterday, when we talked about Greece, they mentioned the civil cooperative. After analyzing the legal framework and the different settings, we discussed the legal regulatory challenges linked to the energy communities, and this is the third part of the book. And the fourth part, finally, is the compared legislation. We have seen that the countries that are close next to Spain, France, Portugal, they also, Italy as well, Netherlands, that has a recent reform and initial energy sector which is relevant, and this is the reason why we have included it as well. And we included the perspective of the states, where the legal framework is very defined of the energy community, and this is very different from the perspective in Europe. We could say actually that the EU has done the transition for consumers and their empowerment, and also the empowerment of the citizens. There's this tension between consumer. But actually, in the United States, This is a transition for the workers, for the just transition. It's interesting to see that there's this dynamic. Our energy communities are moving towards new models for the just transition, and actually the energy transitions in the United States are moving towards our idea in some way of citizen empowerment. This is very, very interesting to see. This is more or less the architecture of the monography generated by this project, and I would like to quote the colleagues that have participated in order.
Jordi Jaria Manzano, Isabel Gallego Córcoles, Inmaculada Revuelta Pérez, Joan Herrera, Aloya López Ferro, Lorenzo Mellado Ruiz, en la tercera parte del libro, Lucía López de Castro, José Ramón Fuentes, Marina Rodríguez Bea, Ingo del Guayo Castilla, Pablo Rodríguez Pajarón, Alejandro Leiva López, Romain Roger, Mariano Majide, Juan José Serrano Araque, Laura Presiche, Remedios Zamora Rosselló, Alba Ford, y en la última parte de Derecho
And in the
Comparado,
last part,
Susana Tavares da Silva, Marta Costa Santo, Roberto Galambioque, Ana María Porporato, Blanche Lormeto, Lea Diestelmayer y Uma Ulka. A todos ellos y todas ellas, muchísimas gracias.
thank you very much to all of them.
Muy bien, gracias.
Very
Andrews.
good.
Poco más
Thank you,
que,
Andrews. I don't have to add much more.
manifestar
I just wanted
mi
to
satisfacción por
express
haber
my
participado
satisfaction for
en
having
este
participated
proyecto del que
in
he
this project.
aprendido
I have learned
mucho cuando nos acercamos
a
a las
lot
comunidades energéticas,
when we
pues
approach
había
these
como
energy
ya
communities.
un
In the first
primer
moment,
bloque de
there was
literatura
a first block of
analizando lo que son
literature
las comunidades energéticas
that
relacionadas
analyzed
con
energy
los temas
communities
de
that related them
participación,
to
de
participation,
democratización,
democratization,
de bienes comunes, etcétera y tal. Y cuando nosotros
and so forth. When
nos
we
pusimos a pensar en algo
started to
relacionado con un
think
proyecto,
of
lo
this
fijamos
kind of
después,
project,
¿no? Porque
we decided it
efectivamente el
afterwards.
título tiene que ver
As the
con
title
el almacenamiento
suggests,
y la,
this has to
la
do with
flexibilidad, pero
storage and
yo creo que ya
flexibility.
desde el primer momento
But
consideramos
from the
la
first
operativa
moment, we
de
considered
estas
the
comunidades
operation
en el
of
sector
these communities
energético.
in the
Es
energy
decir,
sector.
qué es lo que hacen las
That
comunidades
is, what
energéticas
do
o
energy
qué es lo que
communities do,
están llamadas a
or
hacer
what
y
are
cuáles son
they,
las barreras y
what
los
do they
retos
have to do, and what are the
regulatorios para
barriers that
que
they
lleguen
experience.
a serlo, ¿no? Entonces, bueno, pues
So
el resultado
the result
es este libro que
is this
está
book.
clasificado, pues
It is
tiene
classified
4 partes. Yo creo que
by
es
these 4 parts.
interesante esa
I think it
distinción
is interesting to see the
desde el
distinction
punto de vista
from the
geográfico, porque
geographical
realmente, aunque
standpoint,
sean las mismas figuras,
because even
tienen
if the figures are
problemáticas
the
y
same, the
objetivos
problems and the
completamente
goals are completely
distintos.
different.
Bueno, los retos regulatorios
The regulatory
relacionados con
challenges
la operativa en el
related
sector
to the
eléctrico, bueno,
operation
pues
in the electric sector,
los hemos visto ayer,
we have seen them
ayer y hoy,
yesterday and
pero
today.
yo tiendo a pensar que vamos
But
al
I
sistema
want to
dual,
think
o sea,
that
que
we
ya
are
estamos
moving towards a
viendo
dual system.
y bueno, pues hay algo que a mí me llama mucho la
And
atención,
there's
que es ver
something that catches my
escrito
attention,
negro sobre blanco
and it is to
que,
see
fíjate,
written
que claro, que baja el precio de
that
la
actually,
electricidad y
yes,
menudo
the
problema.
price of the electricity falls, and what a problem,
De
right?
verdad que baje el precio de la electricidad
Really,
es un problema.
this reduction in the
Claro,
price of
puede
electricity is
serlo
a problem.
ya en
It can be a problem
este sistema eléctrico tan energético, tan
because in this
complejo, pues
system
para
so
unos es un
complex,
problema, efectivamente. Si se
this can be a
mantienen
problem
los
for some people
esquemas
if
de
the
negocio
schema,
tradicionales, pero
traditional
para
plans are
otros es
maintained.
estupendo,
But for other people, this is great. For other people, from this perspective of the right to the energy, but not taking into account regulation, big markets, and so forth. I think it's very good that Spain will be the leader, or well, here this is not very clear on how things are done, but leader in supplying energy to Europe. But this is the reality. This reality is different from the one of the person who's at home and who only earns 1,200 euros per month. So these systems allows us to bring this innovation. What we want to do is bring this innovation to the people, be innovative, and create this legal regime for the citizens. And in this new legal regime, there will be, and this might be the next research project, because both Andrews and I, we love this topic, but there will be new public services. In India, for example, they already have a national program for refrigeration, because they have thought, how many people will we have in 2050? What are the expectations in terms of temperature? So they have drawn the conclusion that it is crazy to leave this problem alone and not solve it directly. They have planned the solution with local policies. I think that the local panel was very interesting, but because of time constraints, we couldn't dive deeper. But I think that there are local competencies in terms of energy, and if the local council doesn't want to change the legislation, then we have the European legislators who attribute directly to the local competencies and responsibilities. What happens with the waste, for example? Everything comes from the EU. So at the end, there's also this knowledge of the energy concept. It has an economical perspective, and in Europe, this is different. It is very connected to climate and environment. I want to thank the participants, the people who participated in the book. Many of them have been very imaginative. Yes, because actually this is a topic in which the input doesn't come from reality. So sometimes they called and you thought, oh my God, they are going to tell me again that they have no data. So they had to invent. They had to use this imagination. Thank you, Andrews, who has been in charge of the most part of this project. And furthermore, he made me very easy to contribute to this book and nothing else. Thank you as well for attending, and I hope to see you the next times.